Él
He
se
didn't
fue al
go to her
apartamento de
apartment
ella
for
por
love.
amor.
He
Se
went
fue
because
porque
she had
ella
the
tenía
ledger,
el registro,
and Gabriel
y
didn't
Gabriel
trust loose
no
ends.
soportaba los
2
cabos
days before a
sueltos.
wedding that would
Faltando
merge two
poco para una
syndicates,
boda que
his
uniría dos
notoriously punctual
sindicatos.
assistant
Su
vanished.
asistente,
When he
famosa por
finally
su
kicked in the
puntualidad,
rotting wood of her front
había
door,
desaparecido
expecting
cuando,
betrayal,
al final,
the metallic
derribó
scent
la
of
puerta
copper
del
stopped him
apartamento
dead.
podrido de ella,
What he found in
esperando
that
una
suffocating,
traición. El olor
blood-stained room
metálico a cobre
didn't
lo
just break
detuvo en
his
seco.
meticulously ordered
Lo que
world apart.
encontró en aquella
It made him
habitación
call off the
sofocante,
wedding entirely.
llena de
The
sangre,
chalk scratched
no
against
solo
the wool
destruyó su
blend of
mundo
Gabriel's trousers,
meticulosamente
a dry,
ordenado,
irritating
sino que lo
sound
obligó
that
a
vibrated
cancelar por
straight through
completo
to
la
his
boda.
skin.
La
He stood
tiza
perfectly
chirriaba
still on
sobre
the
la lana de
velvet-covered
los
pedestal,
pantalones de Gabriel.
staring straight ahead
Un
into the
sonido
gilded
seco
mirror.
e irritante
The reflection
que le
staring back
vibraba
at him
directamente en
belonged
la
to a
piel.
man who had successfully
Permanecía
sanitized his
perfectamente
own
inmóvil
brutality.
sobre el
The suit was
pedestal
charcoal,
cubierto de
cut
terciopelo,
close to the ribs to
mirando
hide the bulk
fijamente
of the
el
leather
espejo
shoulder
dorado.
holster he refused to take off.
Reflejo que lo
Even for
devolvía la
fittings.
mirada.
Don't breathe so
Pertenecía
heavily,
a un
Gabriel.
hombre que había
Sloane murmured from
higienizado
the
con
plush
éxito
leather sofa
su
behind
propia
him.
brutalidad.
She didn't look up from her
El
phone.
traje era
Her
gris
thumbs
carbón,
tapped rhythmically against
ajustado
the
a las
glass screen,
costillas para ocultar
firing
el
off
volumen de
demands
la
to people whose
cartuchera de
names
cuero en su
she
hombro,
wouldn't bother to
que se
remember.
negaba a quitarse
Bianchi needs
incluso
the
para
break
las
over the shoe
pruebas.
to be perfect. You're
Ya no
shifting.
respiras tan
Gabriel
fuerte,
didn't
Gabriel.
reply. He
Murmuró
rolled his
Sloane
jaw,
desde el
feeling
sofá
the
de cuero
familiar,
afelpado
dull
detrás de
ache of
él,
a tension headache
sin
blooming
levantar
at
la
the base
vista
of
del
his
teléfono.
skull.
Sus
The air in the
pulgares
boutique was
golpeaban
thick with the scent of
rítmicamente la
lavender
pantalla
oil
de
and
vidrio,
stale money.
enviando
It was
peticiones a
suffocating.
personas cuyos
The
nombres
hydrangeas,
ni siquiera se
Sloane said,
molestaba en
finally
recordar.
looking up. Her blonde hair was
Bianchi,
pulled
la
back into a
costura sobre
severe,
el zapato
sleek
debe ser
knot.
perfecta.
She was beautiful in
mueves?
the way a freshly forged
Gabriel
blade was
no
beautiful,
respondió.
sharp,
Movió la
cold,
mandíbula,
and entirely
sintiendo el dolor
unyielding.
sordo y familiar
My
de
mother
una
thinks they look
migraña
too
que
funereal.
florecía en la base de su
I told
cráneo.
her we are merging the
El aire
Kensington
en la
distribution
boutique era
lines with the
espeso,
Romano
con
ports.
olor a aceite
We
de
aren't throwing a
lavanda y
carnival.
dinero rancio.
White, silver,
Era sofocante.
that's the
Hortensias,
palette. Whatever
dijo
you want,
Sloane,
Sloane.
levantando
Gabriel
finalmente
said,
la
his
mirada.
voice flat.
Su cabello
It
rubio
was a
estaba
transaction,
recogido en un
a
moño
contract
severo y
sealed in
elegante.
imported silk
Era
and
hermosa
300
en la
guests.
forma en que
He didn't
una
love
hoja
her.
recién forjada
She didn't love
es
him.
hermosa,
They understood
afilada,
each other perfectly,
fría,
which was exactly
completamente
why the
implacable.
arrangement was supposed to work.
Mamá cree que se ve
But as
demasiado
Bianchi
vulgar.
pinned the cuff,
Le dije que
driving a
estamos
silver
uniendo las
needle through
líneas
the
de
fabric with a
distribución de
practiced
Kensington
flick of his
con
wrist,
los puertos romanos.
Gabriel's focus
No
drifted.
organizamos un
He
carnaval.
looked at the empty space beside the
Blanco,
changing screen.
plateado, negro.
Nora wasn't there.
Esa es la
Nora
paleta.
Quinn had been his assistant for
quieres,
4
Sloane,
years. She was the
dijo
buffer
Gabriel,
between his
con la
violent,
voz plana.
chaotic reality
Era
and the
una
sterile
transacción,
corporate
un
front he
contrato sellado
maintained.
en seda
She knew how
importada
he took his
y
coffee,
300
black,
invitados.
burning hot,
Él no
and
la
she knew
amaba.
exactly how much
Ella
cash
no
to
lo
slip to the
amaba.
beat cops in the
Se
harbour
entendían
district to keep them
perfectamente,
looking the other way.
razón por la cual
She was a
el
ghost in the
arreglo
machine,
debía funcionar.
a woman of
Pero
unremarkable
mientras
height,
Bianchi prendía
practical
el
shoes,
puño,
and an
empujando una
unnerving
aguja de
lack of
plata a
intimidation.
través de la
When the
tela con un
Kensington
movimiento
enforcers had crowded his
practicado de
office
muñeca,
last month, posturing and
atención de
throwing their weight
Gabriel
around,
se
Nora had
desvió.
simply walked through the
Miró el
middle of them,
espacio vacío
carrying
junto
a
al
stack of
biombo.
files, and
Nora
politely
no
asked a
estaba
man
allí.
twice her size to
Nora
move his
Quinn
foot so
había
she could
sido su
vacuum the
asistente
rug.
durante
She was
4
always there.
años.
Until
Ella era el
48 hours ago.
amortiguador entre su realidad
Gabriel stepped
violenta
off the
y
pedestal.
caótica y la
Signore
fachada
Romano,
corporativa
Bianchi
estéril que
protested,
mantenía.
his hands fluttering.
Sabía cómo
The
tomaba su
jacket,
café.
we're done,
Negro,
Gabriel said,
caliente,
shrugging
y
off
sabía
the unfinished
exactamente
coat
cuánto
and
dinero
tossing it
darle a los
over a velvet
policías del
chair.
distrito portuario
Sloane
para
finally
que
put her
miraran
phone
hacia
down,
otro
her
lado.
perfectly arched
Era
eyebrows
un
drawing
fantasma
together
en el
in a
sistema.
sharp line of
Una mujer de
irritation.
estatura común,
Gabriel,
con
what are you
zapatos
doing?
prácticos
The wedding
y
is in
una
2
ausencia
days.
de
The photographer
intimidación
needs the
que
final.
desconcertaba.
I have a leak.
Cuando los
Gabriel
hombres de la
interrupted,
familia
pulling
Kensington
his
habían
dark dress
invadido
shirt
su
from the
oficina
rack
el
and
mes
shrugging it
pasado,
on. He
mostrando
buttoned
sus
it with quick,
músculos,
impatient
Nora
fingers.
simplemente
Nora
había
hasn't checked
atravesado
in for
entre
2
ellos,
days.
cargando una
Sloane
pila
let
de
out a short,
carpetas,
elegant
y había
sigh,
pedido
crossing her
cortésmente a
long
un hombre
legs.
del doble de su
Your
tamaño
secretary?
que moviera
Fire
el pie
her.
para poder
Hire
pasar
someone who
la
understands
aspiradora.
the stakes of this week.
Siempre estaba allí
She's
hasta
probably just
hace 2
hungover
días.
or looking for a
Gabriel
raise.
bajó del
Let
pedestal.
HR handle it.
Señor
Gabriel
Romano,
stopped buttoning unbuttoning his
protestó
cuffs.
Bianchi con
He
las
looked at
manos
Sloane,
agitándose.
really looked at
El
her.
saco.
Her skin
He
was
terminado,
flawless, her
dijo
nails
Gabriel,
manicured,
apartando
her
el
life
saco sin
entirely
terminar, y
insulated from the
arrojándolo
blood that
sobre
paid
una
for the
silla de
ring on her left
terciopelo.
hand.
Sloane dejó por
She's
fin
not a
el teléfono.
secretary,
Sus
Gabriel
cejas
said,
perfectamente
his voice
arqueadas
dropping an
se
octave,
fruncieron en una
carrying the
línea aguda
dangerous,
de
quiet
irritación.
rasp that made grown
Gabriel,
men empty
¿qué
their
haces?
bladders.
La boda es en 2 días.
She holds the
El
encryption keys to
fotógrafo
the offshore
necesita la
accounts.
prueba final.
She has the physical ledger for the
Tengo
doc
una fuga de
payoffs.
información.
If she's gone,
La
she's either
interrumpió
selling me
Gabriel,
out or
tomando
she's
la
dead.
camisa negra de
And
la
you think
percha
dealing with a
y
rogue employee
poniéndosela.
is a priority right
La
now?
abotonó con dedos
Sloane stood
rápidos
up,
e impacientes.
smoothing down her skirt.
Nora no ha dado
My father
señales de
is
vida
flying
en
in
2
from
días.
Boston tonight.
Sloane
We have the rehearsal
soltó
dinner.
un suspiro corto
Send one
y
of your
elegante,
thugs to find her.
cruzando sus largas
Gabriel
piernas.
strapped the leather holster across his
Despide a tu
chest.
secretaria.
The heavy,
Contrata a
comforting weight
alguien
of
que
the Glock
entienda las
pressed against his
apuestas de
ribs.
esta semana.
I don't send people
Probablemente
to
esté
handle my
resacosa
liabilities,
o
Sloane.
buscando un
I handle them
aumento.
myself.
Deja
He
que el
walked out
hacker
of the
se
boutique
encargue.
before she could reply.
Gabriel
The
se
little
detuvo
brass
al
bell above
abotonarse
the
los
door,
puños.
chiming a cheerful,
Miró a Sloane.
mocking goodbye.
La miró de verdad.
The air
Su piel
outside
era
was thick
impecable.
with the threat of rain.
Sus uñas,
The sky above the
perfectamente
city was a
cuidadas.
bruised, ugly
Su vida,
purple.
completamente
Gabriel pulled
aislada
his
de la
coat collar
sangre
up
que
against the
apagaba el
chill
anillo en su
and
mano
walked
izquierda.
briskly to the idling black SUV
Ella no es una
parked
secretaria,
illegally on the
dijo
curb.
Gabriel,
His driver,
bajando la voz
Liam,
una octava,
flicked his cigarette
usando
into
ese
the gutter
tono
and
peligroso y
scrambled into the
susurrado
driver's seat.
que hacía
Where
temblar
to,
a
boss?
hombres maduros.
Liam asked,
Ella tiene
eyeing
las claves
Gabriel's grim
descifrado para las
expression in the
cuentas
rearview
offshore.
mirror.
Tiene el registro
Southside,
físico de los
Gabriel
pagos
said,
del puerto.
staring out the
Si ha
window as the first
desaparecido,
heavy
o
drops
me
of
está
rain
vendiendo,
began to smear the
o está
glass.
muerta.
Garrison
Si crees
Street,
que
the
ocuparte de un
apartment building
empleado
at the dead end.
insumiso es una prioridad
Liam
ahora.
hesitated, his hands
Sloane se
tightening on the
levantó,
wheel.
alisándose
Garrison?
la falda.
Boss,
Mi
that's
padre viene
Kensington
esta noche
territory.
desde Boston.
We're not supposed to
Tenemos
have
la
boots
cena
on
de
the ground
ensayo.
there until the ink is
Envía a
dry
uno de
on the
tus
marriage
hombres a buscarla.
certificate.
Gabriel
Drive the car,
se
Liam.
ajustó la
The
cartuchera
SUV
de
pulled
cuero
into
sobre el
traffic.
pecho.
Gabriel
El
leaned
peso
back
familiar
against the leather
y
headrest,
reconfortante
closing
de la
his
Glock,
eyes. The irritation
presionando
in his
contra sus
chest was
costillas.
slowly morphing into something else.
Yo no envío
Something
hombres a
cold and
ocuparse de
ugly.
mis
He paid
responsabilidades,
Nora
Sloane.
a salary that should
Me
have
ocupo
secured
yo
her a
mismo.
high-rise downtown, with a
Salió de la
doorman
boutique
and
antes
secure
de que ella
parking.
pudiera
When he had
responder.
demanded her home
La
address from
pequeña
his head of
campanilla de
security an
latón
hour
sobre la
ago,
puerta
he had
sonó
stared
una
at the text
despedida
message
alegre
in
y
disbelief.
burlona.
Garrison Street
Afuera,
was a decaying
el aire
artery
era
of the
pesado
city,
por la
choked
amenaza
with
de
condemned
lluvia.
buildings and
El
desperate
cielo
people.
sobre la ciudad
It was the kind of
era de
place
un
where
morado
streetlights were shot out
amoratado
for
y
privacy,
feo.
and the police
Gabriel
only came to
se
collect
levantó el
bodies.
cuello de la chaqueta
Why was
contra
she
el
living
frío
there?
y caminó
What kind of
rápidamente
game was she
hacia
playing?
ese
He thought
Ucoveto
back to the
negro
last time he saw
estacionado
her.
ilegalmente en el
Tuesday
bordillo.
evening.
Su
The
chofer,
office was empty.
Liam,
She was standing
arrojó el
by the
cigarro a la
shredder, feeding
alcantarilla
documents into the
y se
machine.
subió rápidamente al
She had
volante.
looked tired. Her
¿Dónde,
skin,
jefe?
usually
Preguntó
a
Liam,
pale,
observando
healthy
la
cream,
expresión
had been
sombría de
sallow.
Gabriel en el
He had
espejo
noticed a
retrovisor.
bruise on her jawline,
Sur,
partially
dijo
covered by
Gabriel,
poorly matched
mirando por la
concealer.
ventana.
When he asked
Cómo
her
las
about
primeras
it,
gotas
she had offered a
pesadas de
dry,
lluvia
flat smile
comenzaban a
and
manchar el
blamed an
vidrio.
open cabinet door.
Cala Garrison,
He had
el
accepted the lie
edificio al
because it
final
was
de la calle.
convenient. Because he had a
Liam
wedding
dudó,
to plan,
sus manos
Gabriel opened
apretando
his
el
eyes,
volante.
feeling a sudden,
Garrison,
sharp
jefe,
twist of
es
self-disgust.
territorio
He had
Kensington.
ignored the
No
warning
podemos
signs.
poner un pie
If she had taken
allí
the
hasta
ledger
que
to the
la tinta se
Kensingtons to
seque
derail the
en el
merger, he would
certificado de
have to kill her.
matrimonio.
The
Conduce,
thought sat heavy in
ordenó
his
Gabriel.
stomach. A leaden
Liam se
weight that
incorporó al
tasted like
tráfico.
ash.
Gabriel
He didn't
se
want to kill
recostó en el
Nora.
asiento de cuero,
He wanted to shake
cerrando
her.
los ojos.
He wanted to
La
demand
irritación
why
en
she
su
had
pecho
disrupted his
se
perfectly
transformaba
ordered life.
lentamente en
The city
otra
shifted
cosa,
around them as they
algo
drove.
frío y
The glass
desagradable.
and steel towers of
Le
the
pagaba a
financial
Nora un
district
salario
gave way to
que
the
debería
crumbling brick
haberle
and rusted
asegurado un
iron of the
apartamento
industrial
en un
sector.
edificio de lujo
The
en
rain
el
fell
centro,
harder now,
con
a
portero
steady,
y
rhythmic drumming
estacionamiento
against the
vigilado.
roof of the SUV.
Cuando le había
The
pedido la
streets
dirección de
narrowed,
su casa a
littered
su
with
jefe de
overflowing
seguridad
dumpsters
una
and
hora
broken
antes,
glass that
había
crunched beneath
visto el
the heavy
mensaje
tires.
con incredulidad.
Pull over here,
La
Gabriel
calle
ordered,
Garrison
as they
era una
approached a
arteria
row
en
of four-story
descomposición
brick
de la ciudad,
buildings that
llena
looked
de
like they were
edificios
slouching against
condenados
one another
y
for
gente
support.
desesperada.
I should come
Era
with you,
el tipo de
Liam
lugar
offered,
donde las
putting the
bombillas de
car
la
in
calle
park and
estaban
reaching for the
rotas
door
por
handle.
intimidad. Y la
Stay with the
policía
car.
solo venía venía a
Keep
recoger
the engine
cadáveres.
running. Gabriel
¿Por qué
stepped
vivía
out
allí?
into the rain.
¿Qué
The
clase
cold
de
water
juego estaba
immediately
jugando?
soaked through the shoulders of his
Pensó
coat.
en la
He
última vez
didn't
que la
run.
vio.
He walked
En la
with
oficina,
deliberate, heavy
al
steps
anochecer,
toward the entrance
estaba
of the
junto
building.
a la
There
destructora
was
de
no buzzer.
documentos.
The glass in the front door had been
introduciendo
smashed
papeles en la
out and temporarily
veía
patched with a
cansada.
sheet of warped
Su piel,
plywood.
normalmente
He
de
pushed
un
the door
crema
open.
pálido y
The hinges
saludable,
screamed in
era
protest.
amarillenta.
The stench hit
Había
him the
notado
second he
un
crossed the
moretón en su
threshold.
mandíbula,
It was a suffocating
cubierto
cocktail of
parcialmente con un
boiled cabbage,
corrector mal
stale
combinado.
cigarette smoke, and the
Cuando le
sharp,
preguntó por
chemical
ello,
tang of
le
bleach,
ofreció una
trying and
sonrisa
failing to
seca y
mask the
plana,
scent of cat
y
urine.
culpó a
The
una
hallway
puerta
was
de
narrow,
armario abierta.
the walls painted a
Aceptó
sickly,
la mentira porque era
institutional
conveniente,
green that was
porque
peeling
tenía
away
una
in
boda
long,
que
dry
planificar.
strips. A
Gabriel
single
abrió
fluorescent
los
tube
ojos,
flickered on the
sintiendo
ceiling,
un
buzzing
retorcijón
like an angry
repentino
hornet.
y agudo de
Gabriel's hand
repugnancia
instinctively brushed
hacia
against
sí
the lapel
mismo.
of his coat, feeling
Había
the hard
ignorado
outline
las
of his
señales de
gun.
advertencia.
He moved
Si ella
silently
hubiera
up the
llevado el
stairs.
registro a la
The wooden
familia
steps
Kensington
groaned in
para
protest
sabotear
under
la
his
fusión,
weight. He passed
debería
the second
haberla
floor,
matado.
then the third.
El
The
pensamiento
sounds
se
of
le
life
asentó
bled through the
pesadamente en
thin
el
walls,
estómago,
a
un
baby
peso
crying
crudo que sabía a
relentlessly,
ceniza.
the muffled,
No
tinny
quería
dialogue
matar a
of a
Nora.
game show on a cheap
Quería
television,
sacudirla.
an argument
Quería
in a language he
preguntarle
didn't
por qué
recognize.
había
It was a
perturbado su
world
vida
of survival,
perfectamente ordenada.
raw and unpolished,
La ciudad
the exact
cambió a su
opposite of the
alrededor
world he had
mientras
just
avanzaban.
left. The
Las
exact
torres de
opposite of
vidrio y
Sloane.
acero del distrito financiero
He reached the
dieron
fourth
paso
floor,
al ladrillo que se
apartment
desmoronaba
4B.
y al hierro oxidado del
The
sector
door was
industrial.
heavy, solid
La
oak
lluvia
that
caía
looked
más
out of
fuerte
place
ahora.
in the
Un
dilapidated
golpeteo
building,
rítmico
though
y
the wood was
constante
deeply
sobre el
scratched
techo
near the
del
lock.
SUV.
Gabriel reached out,
Las calles se
turning the brass
estrecharon,
knob.
llenas de
It didn't
contenedores
catch.
desbordados
The latch was
y vidrio
completely
roto
broken.
que
The
crujía
metal
bajo los
casing
neumáticos
splintered.
pesados.
He pushed the door open,
Detente
drawing his
aquí,
weapon in one
ordenó
fluid,
Gabriel.
practiced
Cuando se
motion.
acercaron a una
He stepped
hilera de
inside,
edificios de
sweeping the
ladrillo
room
de
with the
4
barrel of the
pisos
gun.
que parecían
The
apoyarse
apartment was
unos en
freezing.
otros.
It was colder
Debería ir con
inside than
usted,
it was out in the
ofreció
rain.
Liam,
There was no
poniendo el
heat.
coche en
Gabriel
estacionamiento
stood in the
y
entryway,
estirándose hacia
blinking
la
against
manija
the
de la
gloom.
puerta.
The shades were pulled
Quédate en el
down
coche,
over the single
mantén el
window,
motor
casting
encendido.
the room in a heavy,
Gabriel
grey twilight.
salió a la lluvia.
He lowered the gun
El agua
slightly,
fría
his brow
empapó
furrowing.
inmediatamente
There was
sus
no
hombros.
furniture.
No corrió.
None.
Caminó
The
con
living room
pasos
was an empty
deliberados y
expanse of
pesados hacia
scuffed
la
hardwood
entrada del
floor.
edificio.
No couch,
No había
no
timbre.
television, no
El vidrio
rugs.
de la puerta
The only
principal
object in the room
estaba
was a
roto y
cheap
parcheado
folding table
temporalmente
pushed against the
con
far
una tabla
wall.
de madera torcida.
On it sat a
Empujó la
bulky,
puerta.
outdated
Las
laptop,
bisagras
a stack
chillaron
of
en
heavily
señal de
encrypted
protesta.
external hard
El
drives,
hedor lo
and a
golpeó
neat,
tan
meticulously
pronto como cruzó el
organized
umbral.
row of manila folders.
Era un cóctel
His folders,
sofocante de
the
repollo
syndicate's
hervido,
business.
humo
Where
de
was her
cigarrillo
life?
viejo
Where
y
was
el
the
olor
money he
químico
paid her?
penetrante del
Nora!
cloro
He
que
called out.
intentaba sin
His voice
éxito
sounded too
enmascarar
loud in
el
the
olor
hollow
a
space,
orina de gato.
harsh and intrusive.
El vestíbulo
No
era
answer.
estrecho.
Only the
Las
sound
paredes
of the rain
pintadas de
lashing
un
against
verde
the glass.
institucional enfermizo
Gabriel
que
moved
se
further
pelaba
into the
en largas
apartment.
tiras
He
secas.
checked the tiny galley kitchen.
Un solo tubo
The refrigerator was
fluorescente
unplugged,
parpadeaba
the
en el
door
techo,
hanging open to reveal
zumbando
empty
como
wire
una
shelves.
avispa.
The sink was dry.
Gabriel llevó
He turned down the short
instintivamente
hallway
la mano
toward
a
the
la
bedroom
solapa de su
and the
chaqueta,
bathroom.
sintiendo el
That's when he saw
contorno
it,
duro de la
smears
pistola.
of dark, rusty
Subió en
brown on the
silencio las
linoleum
escaleras.
floor.
Los escalones de
Knots,
madera
splatters,
gimieron
drags,
bajo su peso.
The dragging marks of
Pasó el
someone who
segundo
couldn't lift
piso,
their own weight.
luego
The metallic
el
scent
tercero.
of copper, sharp and
Los
heavy,
sonidos de la
cut through
vida
the
se
damp
filtraban a
cold of the
través de las
apartment.
paredes delgadas.
Gabriel's
Un
pulse
bebé
kicked against
llorando
his
sin
throat.
cesar.
He followed the
El
trail.
diálogo
It led
apagado
to the
y
half-open
minúsculo de
bathroom
un
door.
concurso de
He pushed the
televisión.
door wide.
Una
The
discusión
hinges didn't
en un
creak.
idioma que no
Nora was sitting on the
reconocía.
floor, wedged in
Era
a
un
narrow
mundo de
space between the
supervivencia
chipped
cruda y
porcelain
tosca.
bathtub and the
El
toilet.
polo opuesto del
She was
mundo
illuminated by
que
a single,
acababa de dejar.
bare bulb
El polo
hanging
opuesto
from a
de
wire
Sloane.
above the sink.
Llegó al cuarto piso.
She wasn't dead,
Apartamento 4B.
but she looked like she was
La
trying to be.
puerta era de roble
She was
macizo,
wearing an
lo que
oversized grey
parecía
t-shirt,
inapropiado en el
completely
edificio
soaked through with
ruinoso,
sweat and dark,
aunque la madera
blossoming
estaba
stains of blood.
profundamente
Her
rayada
bare
cerca
legs
de
were
la
splayed
cerradura.
out in front of her.
Gabriel
A thick,
extendió la mano
bloody
y
towel
giró
was
el
wadded
pomo
up
de
and
latón.
pressed hard against her
No
left
estaba
thigh.
trabado.
Her head
La
lolled to the
cerradura
side against the
estaba
bathtub.
completamente
Her
rota.
skin was the color
La
of
carcasa
old
de metal
parchment,
agrietada.
grey,
Empujó la
translucent,
puerta,
stretched tight
sacando el
over the
arma en
bones of
un
her face.
movimiento fluido
The
y
bruise he had seen
practicado.
on Tuesday was
Entró,
now a massive,
barriendo la
ugly
habitación con el
sprawl of
cañón de la
purple and
pistola.
yellow, covering
El
half her
apartamento
face.
estaba helado. helado.
Her lower lip was
Hacía más
split.
frío dentro.
She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't holding
No
his
había
ledger to sell to the
calefacción.
Kensingtons. She
Gabriel
was holding a
se
curved
detuvo en la
needle,
entrada,
threaded with thick
parpadeando en la
black
penumbra.
nylon. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't find the grip to push it through her own skin. Gabriel froze. For a man who had built an empire on violence, who had watched men die without his heart rate spiking, the sight of his quiet, unassuming assistant trying to stitch up her own bullet wound in a freezing, empty bathroom felt like a physical blow to the sternum. He dropped his gun on the edge of the sink. It landed with a heavy clack. Nora's head snapped up. Her eyes, usually sharp and observant, were glassy and unfocused with fever. She stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just let out a dry, rattling breath and dropped her head back against the tub. "You're tracking mud on the floor, boss," she rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. Gabriel fell to his knees beside her. The cold seeping through his expensive trousers didn't register. He reached out, his large hands hovering over her for a second before he gripped her wrist, gently but firmly, prying the needle from her trembling fingers. "What happened?" he demanded. His voice was too harsh, too loud, cracking the fragile silence of the room. He didn't want to sound angry, but the panic rising in his chest had nowhere else to go. "Who did this? Don't yell at me," Nora whispered, closing her eyes. "I have a headache." "Nora, look at me." Gabriel grabbed her chin, tilting her face up. Her skin was burning hot. The fever was raging. "Who shot you?" She let out a weak, humorless laugh that ended in a cough. "Nobody shot me, Gabriel. Do I look careless? It was a knife, a very big, very ugly knife." Gabriel pulled the wadded towel away from her thigh. The wound was deep, jagged. Someone had dragged a blade across the muscle, trying to hamstring her. It was weeping sluggishly, the edges inflamed and angry red. Infection had already set in. "Why didn't you call the syndicate doctor?" Gabriel snarled, grabbing a relatively clean section of the towel and pressing it back against the wound. Nora flinched, a sharp hiss escaping her lips. "Why didn't you call me? The doctor works for your uncle," Nora panted, her hands gripping the edge of the bathtub until her knuckles turned white. "And your uncle works for the Kensingtons." Gabriel went perfectly still. The blood rushing in his ears sounded like the ocean. "What did you say?" Nora opened her eyes. The fever was there, but the sharp, cynical intelligence that made her indispensable cut straight through the haze. She looked at him with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "The merger is a hostile takeover, Gabriel. Sloane's family isn't joining you. They're absorbing you. The hit was supposed to happen at the rehearsal dinner tonight. Poison. Clean. They blame a rival family. Sloane plays the grieving widow, and her father takes the docks." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "I found the digital trail on Tuesday. Your uncle routed the payoff money to the caterers. I went to intercept the courier carrying the physical proof. The courier was a Kensington enforcer. He was faster than I thought." She gestured weakly to her leg, then to her bruised face. "But I got the proof. It's on the hard drive. On the table." Gabriel stared at her. The silence in the bathroom stretched out, heavy and suffocating. He thought of Sloane, sitting in the boutique, complaining about the color of the flowers while she planned his funeral. He thought of his uncle, kissing him on the cheek at Christmas. And then he looked at Nora, living in a freezing box, bleeding out on cheap linoleum, protecting him. "Why?" Gabriel asked. The word was stripped of all authority. It was just a raw, desperate question from a man who suddenly realized he was standing on quicksand. "Why didn't you bring this to me immediately? Why are you living like this?" Nora let her head roll toward him. A cynical,
No lloró.
tired
Solo
smile
dejó escapar
ghosted
un
across her
suspiro
split
seco
lip.
y dejó caer la cabeza
Because you were
contra la
picking out
bañera.
suits, Gabriel.
Estás
You
ensuciando
wanted
el
this
piso.
merger so badly
Jefe,
you stopped looking at the
susurró.
shadows.
Su voz
If I
sonaba
brought
como
it to you
vidrio
without
roto.
ironclad
Gabriel
proof,
cayó de
you would have
rodillas a
thought
su
I was
lado.
trying to
El
sabotage the wedding.
frío
She
que
looked
se
away,
filtraba a través
staring
de
at the
sus caros
peeling paint on
pantalones
the opposite wall.
ya no importaba.
And I live like this because
Extendió la mano.
my mother's medical care
Sus
costs
grandes palmas
$8,000 a
flotando
month.
sobre ella.
The
Un
facility is
segundo
nice.
antes de
They have
sujetarle la
gardens.
muñeca.
Gabriel felt a
Tomando
knot form
suavemente,
in his
pero con
throat,
firmeza,
tight and
la
hard.
aguja de sus dedos
He paid her enough to
temblorosos.
afford the care
¿Qué
and a
pasó?
life for herself.
Exigió.
But she
Su
was
voz
sinking
era
every
demasiado
penny into
áspera,
keeping her mother
demasiado
comfortable,
fuerte,
choosing to live in
rompiendo
squalor
el
so he
frágil
wouldn't know she
silencio
was
de la
vulnerable.
habitación.
She didn't
No
want him
quería
to think
sonar
she was a
enojado,
liability.
pero el pánico que le
Hold
subía
still,
por el pecho
Gabriel
no tenía
commanded,
otro lugar
his
a
voice
donde
dropping
ir.
to a low, rough
¿Quién te hizo
rumble.
esto?
Gabriel didn't ask
No me
permission.
grites,
He shoved his
susurró
$3,000
Nora,
bespoke
cerrando
suit
los
jacket
ojos.
aside,
Me
rolled up
duele
his
la
sleeves,
cabeza.
and opened the small,
Nora,
pathetic
mírame.
first aid kit sitting on the
Gabriel la
toilet
tomó
seat.
por la barbilla,
He found a bottle of rubbing
levantándole el
alcohol.
rostro. Su
This is
piel
going to
ardía.
burn, he
La
warned.
fiebre era alta.
Just do it, Nora
¿Quién
gritted
te
out,
disparó?
grabbing the rim of the
Ella
bathtub with
soltó
both
una
hands.
risa
He
débil y
poured
sin
the
humor
alcohol
que
directly over
terminó
the
en
jagged
tos.
slice in her thigh.
Nadie me disparó,
Nora's
Gabriel.
back arched,
Parezco
a
tan
strangled,
descuidada.
guttural sound
Fue un
tearing
cuchillo.
from her throat.
Uno muy grande
She bit
y
down
muy
on her
feo.
own shoulder to keep from
Gabriel
screaming,
retiró la
her
toalla
body
arrugada de
trembling
su muslo.
violently under his
La
hands.
herida era profunda,
Gabriel's jaw locked.
dentada.
He felt every tremor passing
Alguien
through
había
her.
pasado
He
una
threaded the
hoja a
needle with
través de
steady,
sus músculos,
mechanical precision.
intentando
He
dejarla
had sewn up
coja.
his own men before,
Supuraba
in basements and
perezosamente.
back alleys.
Los bordes
But this felt
inflamados y
different.
rojos.
Every
La
puncture of the needle through
ya
her
se
pale
había
skin
instalado.
felt like an indictment
¿Por
of
qué no
his own
llamaste al médico del
blindness.
sindicato?
You're
Preguntó
heavy-handed,
Gabriel,
Nora
agarrando una
gasped,
sección
her forehead slick with
relativamente
sweat.
limpia de la toalla
You should have let the
y
courier go,
presionándola de nuevo
Gabriel
sobre la
said,
herida.
his voice hard,
Nora se
focusing
estremeció.
entirely on
Un
pulling the
silbido
nylon
agudo
thread
escapando
tight.
entre sus labios.
You are an
¿Por qué no
administrator,
me llamaste a mí?
Nora,
El médico
not
trabaja
muscle.
para tu tío.
I protect my
Jadeó
desk,
Nora,
she
sus
snapped
manos
back,
agarrando
though
el
it
borde
lacked
de la
heat.
bañera hasta
And
que
you
sus
sit behind
nudillos
it.
se volvieron blancos.
You could have died.
Y tu tío
I'm not
trabaja
dead
para
yet.
Kensington.
Stop nagging.
Gabriel
He tied
se
off
quedó
the stitch,
paralizado.
snipping the thread with
La
a pair
sangre
of
que le
tiny
zumbaba en
rusted
los oídos
scissors.
sonaba
He grabbed a
como un
roll of
acantilado.
gauze and began
¿Qué
wrapping
dijiste?
her leg, pulling
Nora
it tight
abrió
enough to
los
stem
ojos.
the bleeding,
La
but
fiebre
gentle
estaba
enough
allí,
not to cause more
pero la
pain.
inteligencia
As he worked,
aguda
he
y
noticed the
cínica
other
que la
marks on
hacía
her,
indispensable
a faint
atravesó
silver scar
directamente
on
la
her
niebla.
collarbone.
Lo
A
miró
burn
con una
mark on her
mezcla de
wrist he had
lástima
never seen,
y
because she
agotamiento.
always wore long
La fusión
sleeves.
es una adquisición
She was a
hostil,
map
Gabriel.
of quiet,
La familia Sloan
unacknowledged
no se une a
violence.
ti.
She
Te
took the
absorbe.
hits meant for his
El ataque
empire,
iba a tener lugar
swallowed
en
the
la cena de
pain,
ensayo
and
de
handed
esta
him his
noche.
morning coffee with a blank
Veneno,
face. He finished the
limpio.
knot on the bandage.
Culparán a una
He stayed on his
familia
knees,
rival.
his hands resting
Sloan
lightly on her shins.
interpretará el papel
His
de
dark
viuda
shirt was
afligida,
ruined,
y su
stained
padre
with
tomará
patches
el
of her
control
blood.
de los
He
muelles.
smelled like cheap
Tragó con
alcohol and
dificultad.
sweat.
Su garganta
From the
se
empty living
contrajo.
room, a sharp,
Encontré el
intrusive
rastro
sound
digital el
shattered the
martes.
quiet.
Tu tío desvió el
Brrrt.
dinero del pago hacia el
Brrrt.
catering.
Gabriel's
Fui a
burner phone,
interceptar al
the one
mensajero que
only 3 people
transportaba
had the
prueba
number to.
física.
He
El
didn't move.
mensajero era un
He
hombre
just
de
looked at
Kensington.
Nora.
Fue más
She looked
rápido
back
de
at
lo que
him,
pensaba.
her chest rising and
Señaló
falling in
débilmente su
shallow,
pierna.
labored
Luego su
breaths.
rostro amoratado.
Answer it, she whispered.
Pero tengo la prueba.
It's her.
Está en el
It's
disco
almost
duro.
noon.
En la
She'll be
mesa.
asking about the seating arrangements.
Gabriel la miró.
Gabriel reached
El
into his
silencio
pocket
en
and
el
pulled out
baño
the
se
phone.
extendió.
The screen
Pesado y
glared brightly in
sofocante.
the dim bathroom,
Pensó en
displaying
Sloan,
Sloane's
sentada
name.
en la boutique,
He hit accept,
quejándose del
putting
color
the
de las
phone to his
flores,
ear, but
mientras
keeping his eyes
planeaba su
locked on
funeral.
Nora. Where are you?
Pensó en su tío,
Sloane's voice was tinny,
besándolo en la
sharp,
mejilla
and
en
impatient.
Navidad.
Liam said you went to the
Luego
south
miró a
side.
Nora,
Gabriel,
viviendo
the caterer
en una
is threatening
caja
to
helada,
walk if we don't finalize the
sangrando
truffle
en
risotto
linóleo barato,
versus the wild mushroom.
protegiéndolo a él.
Gabriel stared at the blood
¿Por
on
qué?
his hands.
Preguntó
It was
Gabriel.
sticky,
La
drying into
palabra
the creases of
carecía
his
de
knuckles.
toda autoridad.
He thought of his uncle.
Era solo
He
una
thought of the
pregunta
poison.
cruda y desesperada
Sloane,
de un hombre
Gabriel
que se
said.
había dado cuenta
His
de
voice was
repente
terrifyingly
de que
calm.
estaba sobre
It was the
arenas
voice he
movedizas.
used right before a
¿Por
room
qué no me
caught
trajiste
fire?
esto de
What?
inmediato?
And Don't use that
¿Por qué
tone with me.
vives así?
I am trying to hold this event
Nora
together
dejó que
while
su
you
cabeza
chase
se
a runaway
girara hacia
secretary.
él. Una
Listen
sonrisa
to me
cínica
carefully,
y cansada
Gabriel said,
apareció en su
watching
labio
Nora's
partido.
heavy eyelids flutter
Porque
as
tú
the fever
elegías tus
pulled at her.
trajes, Gabriel. Querías
There
tanto
is no
esta
risotto.
fusión que
There is
dejaste
no
de mirar
rehearsal
las
dinner.
sombras.
The
Si
wedding
te
is
hubiera
cancelled.
traído esto sin pruebas de hierro,
Silence
habrías
on the
pensado
other
que
end of the
estaba
line.
tratando de sabotear la
A
boda.
long,
Miró hacia
stretching
otro lado,
void.
fijando la
Excuse me?
pintura que se pelaba
Sloane
en la
finally
pared
hissed,
opuesta.
the facade
Y vivo
cracking.
así porque el
You
cuidado
cannot
médico de mi
cancel this
madre
wedding, Gabriel.
cuesta
Do
$8,000
you
al
understand
mes.
what my father will
El
do?
centro es agradable.
This is a merger.
Tiene jardines.
It's a hostile takeover.
Gabriel sintió
Gabriel
que se le
corrected
formaba
softly.
un nudo en la
And your
garganta.
father is going to find out
apretado y
very
duro.
shortly
Le
that there are
pagaba lo
no ports
suficiente
are
como
closed
para
to him.
permitirse el cuidado
Tell him the
y
courier
una
he
vida
sent on
para ella.
Tuesday was
Pero
sloppy.
ella gastaba cada
Tell him my
centavo
secretary
en
sends her
mantener a su madre
regards.
cómoda, eligiendo
Gabriel,
vivir en la
do not
miseria
call this
para
number
que
again.
él no
If I
supiera
see
que
your
era
uncle or your
vulnerable.
father in my city by
No quería
nightfall,
que él
I
creyera
will
que era
sink
una
them in the
carga.
harbor.
Quédate quieta,
He didn't wait for her
ordenó
response.
Gabriel.
He
Su
crushed the
voz
phone in
bajó
his
a un
hand,
gruñido
feeling
bajo
the
y
cheap
áspero.
plastic screen,
No pidió
spiderweb
permiso.
and crack under
Se
his
quitó
grip
el saco de
before tossing it into the
$3,000,
dry
se
bathtub.
arremangó
He
y
turned his
abrió el
attention back
pequeño
to
y
Nora.
patético botiquín
She
de
was
primeros
smiling.
auxilios
It was a
sobre la
terrible,
tapa del
bloody,
inodoro.
exhausted
Encontró
smile.
una botella de
But it
alcohol
was genuine.
quirúrgico.
You
Va
ruined
a
the
arder,
suit, she murmured,
advirtió.
her eyes
Solo
finally
hazlo,
sliding shut.
apretó los
I
dientes
hated
Nora,
the suit,
agarrando
Gabriel
el
said.
borde de la bañera
He
con
didn't
ambas
hesitate this
manos.
time. He slid
Derramó
one
el
arm
alcohol
under her knees and the other
directamente
behind
sobre
her
el
back,
corte dentado
ignoring
de
her
su
weak
muslo.
groan of
La
protest.
espalda de Nora
He
se
lifted her
arqueó.
off the cold
Un sonido
linoleum.
ahogado
She
y
weighed
gutural
nothing.
escapó
It
de su
enraged him
garganta.
all over again,
Se
how
mordió
little
el hombro
space
para no
she took
gritar.
up, how
Su
easily
cuerpo
she carried the
temblaba
weight of his world
violentamente
while
bajo sus
starving
manos.
herself of her own.
La mandíbula de Gabriel
Where are we going?
se tensó.
She mumbled, her
Sintió
head
cada
falling against his
temblor que la
chest.
recorría.
To my house,
Cosió la
Gabriel
herida
said,
con
carrying
precisión
her out of the
mecánica y
bathroom,
constante.
past the empty,
Había
freezing
cosido a
living
otros
room,
hombres
and out
suyos
the
antes,
splintered wooden
en
door,
sótanos y
to my
callejones.
doctor.
Pero
And then,
esto se
Nora,
sentía diferente.
you are going to tell me
Cada
exactly
punción de la
how we are
aguja
going
a
to
través
tear
de
the
su piel
Kensington
pálida
Syndicate
se
down to the
sentía como
studs.
un cuestionamiento
She
de su
didn't
propia
answer.
ceguera.
She had finally
Tienes
passed out
mano
against his
pesada,
shoulder, her
jadeó
blood
Nora,
soaking into the
con la
ruined
frente
silk of his
brillante
shirt.
de sudor.
Gabriel walked
Debiste
down
dejar
the
que el
dark,
mensajero se
smelling
fuera,
stairwell,
dijo
his
Gabriel,
boots
su
kicking
voz
aside
dura,
broken glass.
concentrándose
He was walking away from
completamente
his
en
wedding.
apretar el hilo de
He was
nylon.
walking into a war.
Eres una
And
administradora,
for the
Nora,
first time in
no una
months,
fuerza de
as he
combate.
held the woman who had
Yo
bled to keep
protejo
him
mi
breathing,
oficina, replicó
Gabriel
ella,
felt
aunque le
entirely awake.
faltaba energía.
The ride to the
Y
estate was
tú
a
estás detrás
masterclass
de
in
ella.
suffocating silence.
Podrías haber muerto.
The black SUV
Todavía no
tore
estoy
through the
muerta.
slick,
No me
rain-battered
regañes.
streets, taking
Ató el
corners
nudo
with
y
a
cortó
reckless
el hilo con
speed
unas
that
tijeras
threw
pequeñas
Nora's
y
unconscious
oxidadas.
body against
Tomó un
Gabriel's
rollo de
chest.
gasa y
He didn't
comenzó a
adjust her.
vendarle la pierna,
He just clamped his
apretando lo
arm tighter
suficiente para
around her
detener el
shoulders,
sangrado,
his jaw
pero con
locked
la
so
suavidad
hard, his
suficiente para
molars
no
ground
causar
together.
más dolor.
The heavy iron gates
Mientras
of his
trabajaba,
compound parted,
notó otras
and Liam
marcas en ella.
slammed the brakes outside
Una
the
fina
front portico
cicatriz plateada
before
en
the
la
vehicle had
clavícula,
even fully
una
stopped.
quemadura en
Get
la
Victor,
muñeca que
Gabriel
nunca había
snapped,
visto,
kicking his door open.
porque siempre
I want him
usaba
in the
mangas
East Wing
largas.
guest room 3 minutes
Ella
ago.
era un mapa de
Liam
violencia
didn't waste time
silenciosa
nodding.
y
He sprinted
desapercibida.
toward the security annex.
Había recibido
Gabriel
los
carried
golpes
Nora through the
destinados a su
cavernous
imperio.
foyer of his home.
Había tragado
His
el dolor
boots left
y le había
dark,
entregado
muddy
el café
prints
de la
across the
mañana con
imported
cara
marble.
neutra.
But the pristine,
Terminó el
curated
nudo en el
perfection of the
vendaje.
house only
Se
made him
quedó de
nauseous.
rodillas,
The
sus
air
manos
smelled of
descansando
beeswax and
ligeramente sobre
expensive
su
air
pierna.
filters.
Su
It
camisa
felt
negra
sterile,
estaba arruinada,
dead.
manchada con la sangre
He
de
hauled
ella.
her up the sweeping staircase,
Olía a
her head
alcohol
lolling
barato y
against his
sudor.
ruined shirt,
Desde
the
la sala de
metallic
estar
stench of her
vacía,
blood clashing
un sonido
violently with the
agudo e
faint scent of
insistente
lemon polish.
rompió el
He kicked
silencio.
open the door to the
Su
East Wing
teléfono de
guest suite.
respaldo,
He
cuyo
deposited her
número
onto the
solo
center of
tenían
the
3
sprawling,
personas.
king-sized bed.
No se movió.
The stark white
Solo miró a
duvet
Nora.
instantly began
Ella
to
lo
absorb
miró a
the
él,
dark red
su pecho
fluid
subiendo y
seeping from
bajando
her
en
hastily
respiraciones
bandaged thigh.
superficiales y
Victor,
angustiosas.
the syndicate's private
Responde,
physician,
susurró.
arrived breathless
Es ella.
2 minutes
Ya
later.
casi es el
He
mediodía.
carried a heavy leather medical
Preguntará por la
bag and
disposición
smelled
de los
faintly of
asientos.
expensive gin and mint
Gabriel
mints.
metió la
Gabriel
mano
what?
en el bolsillo y sacó
Victor
el teléfono.
stopping
La
dead at
pantalla
the foot of the
brillaba
bed.
intensamente
He
en
took
el
in the
baño
blood,
oscuro,
the dirt, the
mostrando el
bruised
nombre
and
de Sloan.
emaciated woman lying
Aceptó
on
la
the
llamada,
Egyptian cotton.
llevando el teléfono
Is that
a su
Miss Quinn?
oído. pero
Fix her,
manteniendo sus
Gabriel
ojos
ordered.
fijos en Nora.
He backed away from the bed,
¿Dónde estás?
his hands hanging
La voz de
uselessly
Sloane
at his
era
sides.
pequeña,
The
aguda
adrenaline was
e
receding,
impaciente.
leaving a cold, jagged
Liam
hollow
dijo que
in
te
his
fuiste al
chest.
sur.
Victor didn't ask
Gabriel,
more questions.
El servicio
He
de
stripped off his
catering
jacket,
amenaza con
snapped
irse
on a
si
pair
no
of latex
finalizamos la
gloves,
elección
and went to
entre
work.
risotto de
Gabriel
trufas
stood by the
y setas
tall, arched
silvestres.
window, listening to the
Gabriel
rain hammer
miraba la
against the
sangre en sus
glass.
manos.
He refused
Estaba
to look away,
pegajosa,
forcing
secándose
himself
en
to
los
watch as
pliegues de
Victor
sus
cut away the
nudillos.
blood-soaked grey
Pensó en su
T-shirt
tío.
and the crude bandages.
Pensó en el veneno.
Her core temperature is
Sloane,
103,
dijo Gabriel.
Victor muttered,
Su voz
hooking a
era
bag of clear fluid
terriblemente
to an
tranquila.
IV pole he
Era la
dragged
voz
from
que
the
usaba
closet.
justo
He
antes de que
expertly
una
found a vein
habitación
in the
se
crook of her
incendiara.
elbow. Dehydration.
Y no uses
Severe
ese tono
exhaustion.
conmigo.
The
Estoy
wound is
tratando de
nasty,
mantener
Gabriel.
este evento
Whoever
unido
did this
mientras
twisted
tú
the blade
corres
before
tras
they
una
pulled it
secretaria
out.
fugitiva.
You did a decent
Escúchame
job
con
stopping the
atención,
bleed.
dijo
But the
Gabriel,
infection is already
observando
racing
cómo
through
los
her
párpados
bloodstream.
pesados de Nora
Gabriel crossed his
se
arms.
agitaban
The
mientras la
damp,
fiebre
clinging
la
silk of his
arrastraba
shirt
hacia
felt like a
abajo.
second skin.
No hay risotto.
Will she
No hay
keep the
cena de
leg?
ensayo.
Yes,
La boda está
provided her
cancelada.
heart doesn't give out from the fever
Silencio al
first.
otro lado de la línea.
Victor began
Un vacío
flushing the
largo
wound
que
with a
se
harsh,
extendía.
chemical-smelling
¿Qué?
antiseptic.
Siseó Sloane
Nora didn't
finalmente,
twitch.
su
She was
fachada
completely
resquebrajándose.
under.
No puedes cancelar
Gabriel,
esta boda.
When was the last
Gabriel,
time she ate?
¿entiendes
Her
lo que
ribs
hará
are
mi
bruising
padre?
her skin from the
Esto es
inside
una
out.
fusión,
Her immune
corrigió
system is
Gabriel con
completely
suavidad.
depleted. It's
Es
like she's
una
been running
adquisición
on
hostil,
fumes and
y
black
tu padre
coffee
pronto
for a year.
descubrirá que los
The words
puertos
felt like a
romanos
physical
están
strike.
cerrados para él.
Gabriel looked
Dale
at
el
Nora's
mensaje de que
collarbones,
aquel mensajero
sharp
que
and
envió el
protruding
martes
beneath the harsh
fue
overhead light.
descuidado.
He thought about the
Dale el
catered
mensaje
lunches
de
he
que mi
expensed to
asistente
his
le
office,
manda saludos.
the heavy, rich
Gabriel,
meals he ate while
no
she
vuelvas a
sat at her
llamar a
desk
este
outside
número
his
nunca
door,
más.
quietly
Si veo a tu
organizing
tío
his
o a tu
empire.
padre en mi ciudad
He had never
antes
once
del anochecer,
if she
los
had eaten.
hundiré en el puerto.
He assumed she took
No
care of
esperó su
herself.
respuesta.
He
Apretó
assumed
el
his
teléfono
money
en su mano,
insulated her from
sintiendo la
hardship.
pantalla de
He had
plástico
assumed
barato
wrong.
cuartearse
Pump
y
her full of
romperse
whatever
bajo su agarre
antibiotics you have,
antes de arrojarlo
Gabriel
a la
said,
bañera
his
vacía.
voice flat, devoid of
Volvió
the
su
tremor he
atención
felt
a
in his
Nora.
hands.
Ella
If she needs a
sonreía.
transfusion,
Era una
take it from me.
sonrisa terrible,
I'm O
sangrienta,
negative.
cansada,
Victor paused,
pero
looking over his
auténtica.
shoulder. The doctor's
Me
eyes were
arruinaste
sharp,
el traje,
evaluating.
murmuró.
Gabriel
Sus ojos
Romano did not
cerrándose
bleed for his
finalmente.
employees. He bled
Odiaba
his
ese
enemies.
traje.
But
Dijo
Victor merely
Gabriel,
nodded, turning
sin
back to
dudar
his
esta vez.
patient.
Deslizó un
I'll
brazo
stabilize her.
bajo sus rodillas
But she needs
y el
sleep,
otro
Gabriel.
detrás de su espalda,
Real sleep,
ignorando su
not
débil
passing out from
gemido de
blood loss.
protesta.
There was a heavy
La
knock on
levantó
the
del
bedroom
frío
door.
linóleo.
Liam stood
No
in the
pesaba
frame,
nada.
holding the stack
Lo
of encrypted
enfureció de
hard
nuevo
drives
lo poco que
and the
ocupaba,
manila folders
lo
he had
fácil que
retrieved
era
from the
cargar
squalid
el peso
apartment
de su
on Garrison
mundo,
Street.
mientras ella se mataba de
Put them in
hambre.
my study,
¿A dónde
Gabriel
vamos?
told him.
Murmuró
Liam
ella,
hesitated,
con la cabeza
glancing at
cayendo sobre
Nora's
su pecho.
motionless form on the
Cállate,
bed.
dijo Gabriel,
Boss,
sacándola
the
del
phones are
baño,
melting
atravesando
down.
la sala de
Sloane's
estar
father
vacía
just
y helada,
landed at the
y
private
saliendo por
airstrip.
la puerta de
And your
madera
Uncle Carlo
agrietada.
is asking why the
Al
rehearsal
médico.
dinner at the
Y luego,
restaurant was abruptly
Nora,
cancelled by
vas a decirme
security.
exactamente
He
cómo
wants
vamos
a
a demoler el
face-to-face.
sindicato Kensington
Gabriel looked
hasta los
away from the bed.
cimientos.
The guilt, the
Ella no
jarring
respondió.
realization of his own
Finalmente
failures
se había desmayado
crystallized
sobre su
instantly
hombro,
into a
su sangre
cold,
empapando la
focused
seda
rage.
arruinada de su
Tell
camisa.
Carlo I'll meet him, Gabriel
Gabriel
said softly.
bajó las oscuras
Tell
y
him to come
malolientes
here.
escaleras,
The study
sus
smelled
botas
of aged
apartando el
leather,
vidrio roto.
rain, and the
Se
sharp
alejaba de su
tang
boda.
of gun oil.
Entraba en una guerra.
Gabriel
Y
sat
por
behind his
primera vez en
massive
meses,
mahogany desk,
mientras
a rag
sostenía
in
a la
one
mujer
hand
que
and the
había
disassembled
sangrado
slide
para
of his Glock
mantenerlo
in the
vivo.
other. He wiped
Gabriel
down the
se
springs with
sentía
mechanical,
completamente
rhythmic
despierto.
precision. The encrypted hard
El
drives
camino
sat
hacia
in
el
a neat
recinto
stack
fue una
next to his
lección
elbow,
de silencio
an impenetrable
sofocante.
brick wall holding
El
the
SUV
secrets of his
negro
impending
recorrió las
demise.
calles
He had
resbaladizas
tried the
y
standard
llenas
syndicate
de
bypass
charcos,
codes.
tomando las
Nothing
curvas
worked.
a una velocidad
Nora had locked
temeraria
them down
que
with an
arrojaba el
algorithm he
cuerpo
couldn't crack.
inconsciente de Nora
Down the
contra el
hall,
pecho de
the house
Gabriel.
was entirely
No la
silent,
reajustó.
save for the
Solo
ticking of the
apretó su
grandfather
brazo
clock
con
in the
más
foyer.
fuerza alrededor
It
de
was
sus
3
hombros. La
a.m.
mandíbula
He slapped
tan
the slide
tensa
back
que sus
onto the
muelas
frame of the gun,
rechinaban.
racking it
Las
once.
grandes puertas
The
de
sharp
hierro de su
metallic
complejo
clack
se abrieron,
echoed off the vaulted
y Liam
ceiling.
pisó el
He
freno
shoved the
frente al
weapon into
pórtico
his shoulder
principal,
banister.
antes de que
A
el
soft,
vehículo se
dragging
hubiera
sound
detenido
caught
por
his
completo.
attention. It wasn't the
Llama a
heavy tread of
Víctor,
his guards.
gritó Gabriel,
It was a
abriendo
friction
la
sound,
puerta. Lo
Fabric
quiero en la
against
habitación de
hardwood.
invitados del ala
Gabriel
este
stood
en
up,
3 minutos.
his hand dropping instinctively
Liam
toward his
no
chest.
perdió el tiempo
He moved
asintiendo.
silently to the
Salió
door of the study
disparado hacia
and
el
pulled it
anexo de
open.
seguridad.
Nora was leaning heavily
Gabriel
against the
llevó
door
a
frame of
Nora
the guest
a
room at the
través
end
del
of the
vasto
hall.
vestíbulo de su
She
casa.
was a ghost.
Sus botas dejaban
She wore
huellas
one of
negras
Gabriel's
y barrosas
oversized
sobre el
black
mármol
button-down
importado.
shirts, which
Pero
Victor
la
had
pureza
clearly
y la
found in his
curaduría de
closet
la casa
and put on
solo
her
le
after
provocaban
cleaning her up.
náuseas. El
It
aire
fell to her
olía a cera de
mid-thigh,
abejas
swimming on
y a
her frail
costosos
frame.
filtros de aire.
Her left leg was
Se
heavily
sentía
bandaged,
estéril,
a thick
muerto.
brace locking her
Subió
knees
la
straight.
escalera de caracol,
Her right hand
la cabeza
gripped
de
the
ella
aluminum
apoyada
pole
en
of
su
the
camisa
IV stand,
arruinada.
using it
El
as a
olor
makeshift
metálico de su
crutch.
sangre
She looked
chocaba
absolutely wrecked.
violentamente con
Her
el
face
vago aroma
was a
del
mottled
pulimento
canvas
de
of
muebles.
purples and sickly yellows,
Abrió la
her
puerta
hair
de
a
la suite
damp,
de
tangled
invitados
mess
del ala
against her
este
neck.
de una patada.
But her eyes,
La depositó
staring
en el
down the
centro de la
long,
enorme
shadowed
cama
hallway at
matrimonial.
him, were
El edredón
violently awake.
blanco e inmaculado
"Get back in bed,"
comenzó
Gabriel ordered.
instantáneamente a
His
absorber
voice
el
was a
líquido
low
rojo
rumble,
oscuro
carrying
que
across
se
the polished
filtraba de su
floors.
muslo
Nora
vendado
didn't listen.
apresuradamente.
She never really did, he
Victor,
realized.
el médico
She just
privado del
managed his
sindicato,
demands in a way
llegó
that made him
jadeando
think he was
2
in
minutos
control.
después.
She took
Llevaba
a
un
step
pesado
forward,
maletín
dragging
médico
her
de
stiff
cuero
leg,
y
the
olía a
wheels of the
loción cara
IV
y a
pole
pastillas de
squeaking
menta.
softly.
Gabriel
swore
¿qué?
under his breath and
Comenzó
closed
Victor,
the distance in 5
deteniéndose
long
en seco al
strides.
pie de la cama.
He stopped right in front of her,
Miró la
his
sangre,
hands hovering,
la suciedad,
unsure where to
la
grab her
mujer
that wouldn't cause her
amoratada y
pain.
demacrada
I said,
tendida
"Get back
sobre
in
el
bed,
algodón
Nora.
egipcio.
You're bleeding through the
Es
dressing."
mía,
"I
repárala",
heard cars,"
ordenó Gabriel.
she rasped. Her
Se
voice
retiró
was
de la
thin,
cama, con las
completely
manos
ruined by
colgando
dehydration.
inútilmente a los
Gravel
costados.
crunching.
La
You sent Liam
adrenalina
out.
se retiraba,
Liam is pulling the
dejando un
guards from
vacío
the
frío
harbour
y
and
dentado en su
redirecting
pecho.
them to the perimeter of this
Víctor
estate.
no hizo más
Now,
preguntas.
bed.
Se quitó la chaqueta,
You can't read the
se puso un
drives,
par de
she said,
guantes de látex
ignoring his
y se
command
puso a
entirely.
trabajar.
She leaned her
Gabriel
weight
se
onto the
paró
IV
junto a la
pole,
alta
her
ventana
knuckles white.
arqueada,
She tilted her
escuchando la
head back
lluvia
to look up
golpear
at
el
him.
vidrio.
You don't
Se
have the
negó a
encryption
mirar
key.
hacia otro lado,
You're flying blind,
forzándose a
Gabriel.
observar
He stared
mientras
down at her.
Víctor
The scent
cortaba
of
la
Victor's
camiseta
sharp
gris
antiseptic
empapada de
lingered
sangre
on her
y
skin,
los vendajes
mixed with a
improvisados.
faint, underlying
Su
smell that
temperatura
was purely
central
her,
es de 39.4,
something like dry
murmuró
paper
Victor,
and rain.
conectando una bolsa de líquido
I can handle
claro
my uncle
a un
and the
soporte de
Kensingtons without a
suero que había
spreadsheet.
sacado
No,
del
you
armario.
can't. Nora
Encontró
fired
una
back,
vena
a
con
spark of
experiencia
genuine
en el
irritation
pliegue del
finally
codo.
breaking through her exhaustion.
Deshidratación,
Carlo didn't just root
agotamiento
the
severo.
caterers money.
La herida
He gave
es
them the
fea,
layout
Gabriel.
of the South
¿Quién
Armory.
hizo esto?
He gave them the
Giró la
shift
hoja antes de
rotations for your
sacarla.
personal
Hiciste
detail.
un trabajo
If you
decente
go to war
deteniendo la
tonight
hemorragia,
without knowing
pero la
exactly what he
infección
sold
ya
them,
corre por su
they will
torrente
slaughter your
sanguíneo.
men. Her
Gabriel
chest heaved,
cruzó los
the
brazos.
effort of speaking
La
draining
seda
the little
húmeda y
color she had
pegajosa de
left
su
in her
camisa
face.
se
She
sentía como
swayed
una segunda
dangerously
piel.
on her good leg. Gabriel caught her
Conservará
by
la
the
pierna.
waist. His
Sí,
large hand
con la
splayed
condición de que
flat
su
across the
corazón no
soft cotton
falle
of his
primero
shirt,
por la fiebre.
pulling her flush against his
Víctor
chest.
comenzó a
She
limpiar la herida
gasped,
con un
a short,
antiséptico
sharp
fuerte que
intake of
olía a
breath,
químicos.
her hands flying
Nora
up to
no
grip
se
his
movió.
forearms.
Estaba
For a second,
completamente
neither of them
inconsciente.
moved. The
Gabriel,
physical contact was
¿Cuándo comió por
jarring.
última vez?
For 4
Sus
years,
costillas
they had
marcan su piel
existed
de adentro
in a
hacia afuera.
sterile,
Su
professional
sistema
orbit,
inmunológico
never
está
touching,
completamente
never
agotado.
crossing the line of the
Es como si
desk.
hubiera estado funcionando
Now,
a base de
she was
vapor
pressed
y
against
café
him,
negro durante un
burning
año.
with fever, her
Las
heart
palabras se
hammering
sintieron
against
como
his
un
ribs like a
golpe
trapped
físico.
bird. She felt
Gabriel
impossibly
miró
small,
las clavículas
yet she
de
was
Nora,
holding the entire weight of
afiladas
his
y
survival
prominentes
in her
bajo la dura
bruised
luz
head.
superior. Pensó en los
"Let me go,"
almuerzos servidos
she
en la
muttered,
oficina,
looking
que
down at
cargaba
his
a los
chest,
gastos,
refusing
las
to meet his
comidas
eyes.
pesadas y
"You're going to
ricas que él
fall.
comía
I'm
mientras
going to the
ella
study,"
estaba en su
she corrected,
escritorio
her
frente a
voice
su
tight
puerta,
with a strange defensive
organizando
panic.
tranquilamente su
"I need
imperio.
my laptop."
Nunca
You
le
need a
preguntó
hospital.
si ella había comido.
Gabriel shifted his grip,
Asumió que se
fully
cuidaba.
intending to pick her up
Asumió
again.
que su dinero la
Nora's
aislaba de
hands
las
tightened on his
dificultades.
arms, her
Había
short nails
asumido
digging
mal.
into his skin.
Ponle
"Gabriel,
todos los
please."
antibióticos que
The word
tengas,
stopped him.
dijo Gabriel.
She never said,
Su voz
please.
plana, sin el
She
temblor que
organized,
sentía
she
en sus
executed,
manos.
she informed.
Si necesita
She
una
didn't beg.
transfusión, la tomo
He
de
finally
mí.
looked at her face.
soy
really looked
o
at the raw,
negativo.
unfiltered terror
Víctor
pooling
hizo
in her
una
dark
pausa
eyes.
y miró por encima
It
del
wasn't
hombro.
fear of the Kensingtons.
Los ojos del
It was
médico
fear
eran
of being
agudos y
useless.
evaluadores.
She had starved herself
Gabriel
and
Romano
lived in
no
squalor
sangraba
to
por sus
prove she could
empleados.
handle her burdens alone.
Sangraba a sus enemigos.
Being helpless,
Pero
Being
Víctor solo
carried,
asintió,
it terrified
volviéndose
her more
hacia su
than a bullet.
paciente.
He slowly
La
released his grip on her
estabilizaré,
waist,
pero
though he
necesita
kept his
dormir,
hands
Gabriel.
close.
Sueño de verdad.
1 hour,
No desmayo
Gabriel
por pérdida de
compromised,
sangre.
his voice dropping to a
Llamaron con
gravelly
fuerza
whisper.
a la puerta del
You give me the
dormitorio.
keys. You show
Liam
me the
estaba en el
drops.
umbral,
And then I am
sosteniendo la
sedating you
pila de
myself.
discos duros cifrados
Nora offered
y
a
las
ragged,
carpetas de cartón
bloody smirk.
que había recuperado del mísero
Deal.
apartamento
The heavy
de
leather
la
of
calle
Gabriel's
Garrison.
desk chair swallowed her.
Ponlos en mi
He
oficina,
had wheeled it
le
around to
dijo
the front
Gabriel.
of the desk,
Liam
refusing
dudó,
to let her walk the
lanzando una
extra 5
mirada a la
feet
forma
behind it.
inmóvil de Nora
He
en la
dragged a
cama.
heavy wooden stool
Jefe,
over for her
los
injured
teléfonos
leg,
están ardiendo.
propping it up
El padre
carefully.
de Sloan
Nora
acaba
didn't
de
wait for him to
aterrizar en
finish
el
hovering.
aeropuerto privado.
She pulled the
Y
laptop
su tío
toward her,
Carlo
her
pregunta
fingers
por
flying
qué la
across the
cena de
keys.
ensayo en el
The movement was
restaurante
jerky,
fue cancelada
uncoordinated from the
repentinamente
fever
por
and the
seguridad.
lingering effects of
Quiere
whatever
una reunión
painkillers
cara
Victor
a
had
cara.
pumped into her IV,
Gabriel apartó la
but
mirada
her
de la
muscle
cama.
memory was flawless.
La culpa,
Gabriel
la
stood directly
constatación
behind her
impactante
chair,
de sus
his
propios
hands resting
fracasos,
on the high leather
se
back.
cristalizó
He watched the screen
instantáneamente
boot up,
en una furia
watched
fría y
lines of
concentrada.
code scroll past
Dile a
as she
Carlo que me
bypassed the
reuniré con
first
él,
layer of security
dijo
on the
Gabriel
hard drive.
lentamente.
You're
Dile
shaking,
que venga aquí.
Gabriel observed quietly.
La oficina olía
Caffeine
a cuero
withdrawal,
viejo,
Nora
a
lied.
lluvia
Her
y al
teeth were
olor
chattering.
penetrante del aceite
Gabriel
de
turned
armas.
and walked to the small
Gabriel
wet bar in the
estaba
corner of the
detrás de
study.
su macizo
He poured a
escritorio
finger
de
of
caoba
aged whiskey
con un
into a
paño
crystal
en una
glass,
mano y el
walked
slide
back, and set it
desmontado
on
de
the
su
desk
Glock
next to
en
her
la otra.
trackpad.
Limpiaba
Drink it.
los resortes
It'll
con
open
una
your blood
precisión
vessels. Help with the
rítmica y
chill.
mecánica.
She eyed the amber
Los
liquid
discos duros
suspiciously,
cifrados
then picked it up with
estaban
a
en una
trembling
pila
hand and
ordenada
threw it
junto
back
a su
in one
codo.
gulp.
Un
She
muro de
coughed
ladrillo
violently, her
impenetrable
face twisting
que
as the
contenía
burn
los
hit her empty
secretos de su
stomach,
inminente
but a faint
colapso.
flush of color crept
Había
into her
probado los
pale
códigos
cheeks
de
a moment
acceso
later.
estándar del sindicato.
Better? He
Nada
asked.
funcionó.
Disgusting.
Nora los había
She croaked,
bloqueado con un
setting the
algoritmo
glass
que
down.
no podía descifrar.
Okay.
La
in.
casa estaba
The screen
completamente
flickered,
en silencio,
revealing a massive,
excepto por el
heavily
tic-tac
indexed
del reloj de
spreadsheet.
pie en el
It was a
vestíbulo.
digital map of
Eran
Gabriel's
las
ruin,
3 de la madrugada.
filtered by the last 30
Encajó el
days,
slide en
Gabriel
el marco del
ordered,
arma
leaning
y la
closer.
amartilló una vez.
His chest
El
brushed the back of
chasquido
her chair.
metálico y agudo
Nora
resonó
tapped the
en el
trackpad.
techo
The
abovedado.
list truncated.
Metió el arma en
Here.
la cartuchera de
Carlo
su hombro.
initiated 7
Un
transfers
sonido
from the
suave
shell
de
company that
arrastre
handles the
le
dock
llamó la
tariffs.
atención.
Small amounts,
No
under
era
the
el
radar.
paso pesado de
But
sus
look at the
guardias.
routing numbers.
Era un sonido de
Cayman,
fricción,
Gabriel
de
said,
tela
his
contra
eyes
madera dura.
narrowing. Sloane's
Gabriel
fathers
se
preferred
puso de pie,
bank.
su
Exactly.
mano
But it's not just money,
instintivamente
Gabriel.
hacia su
Look at the
pecho.
attached files.
Se movió en silencio
Nora
hacia
clicked
la
on a
puerta
small
de la
paperclip
oficina
icon
y la
next to a
abrió.
transaction dated from
Nora
Tuesday
estaba
morning.
apoyada
the day she had
pesadamente
disappeared.
en el marco de la
A
puerta
blueprint
de la
filled the
habitación
screen.
de
It was the
invitados
Romano
al
shipping
final del
warehouse
pasillo.
on Pier 4.
Era un
Red
fantasma.
X's marked the structural
Llevaba
weak
una de las
points,
camisas
the blind
negras de
spots in the
botones
security
demasiado
cameras,
grandes de
and the
Gabriel,
exact location
que
of the
Víctor
breaker
debió
box.
haber encontrado
That warehouse
en el
holds the
armario
smuggled munitions from the
ponérsela
Irish,
después de limpiarlo.
Gabriel said, the
Que
temperature
Víctor
in the
debió
room
haber
plummeting.
encontrado en su
If the
armario
Kensingtons hit
y
that,
ponérsela
the explosion
después de
will level
limpiarla.
3 city blocks, and the
Le
police will
llegaba
blame
hasta la
me
mitad
for
del
domestic
muslo,
terrorism.
nadando
They
en
aren't
su
hitting it to
frágil
blow it
armazón.
up, Nora
Su
corrected,
pierna
her
izquierda
fingers
estaba
flying over the keys
fuertemente
again.
vendada.
She brought
Una
up an
ortesis
intercepted
gruesa
email,
inmovilizaba
heavily
su
encrypted,
rodilla derecha.
but broken down into
Su mano
plain
derecha
text.
agarraba el poste de
They're
aluminio
hitting
del
it to steal the
soporte del
munitions.
suero.
Sloane's
usándolo
father
como
wants your
una
guns
muleta
to arm his
improvisada.
own men for the
Lucía
takeover. The hit is
absolutamente
scheduled for 4
destrozada.
a.m.
Su rostro era
Gabriel
un
looked at the
lienzo
clock on his
manchado de
desk.
púrpura
It was
y de un amarillo
3:15 a.m.
enfermizo.
Carlo is
El
leading the
cabello,
strike team.
una masa
Nora
húmeda y
added
enredada
softly.
sobre su cuello.
He sent an email
Pero
to
sus
Sloane's
ojos,
father,
que miraban a
confirming
lo
he has the
largo del
gate
pasillo
codes.
sombrío hacia él,
The silence in the study was
estaban
absolute,
violentamente
thick as wet
despiertos.
cement.
Vuelve a la
Gabriel
cama,
stared at the
ordenó
name on
Gabriel.
the screen.
Su voz
Carlo
era un gruñido
Romano,
grave,
The
que
man who
atravesaba
had taught
los
him how
suelos
to
pulidos.
shoot. The
Nora
man who had
no
stood at his
obedeció.
father's funeral
Ella
and
nunca
sworn
obedecía
loyalty to the
realmente.
bloodline.
Se dio
Gabriel
cuenta.
didn't yell.
Solo
He didn't
gestionaba
smash
sus
anything.
exigencias de una
He
manera
just
que lo hacía
inhaled
creer
slowly
que
the
él
scent of the rain
tenía
outside,
el
filling his
control.
lungs,
Dio un
and
paso
exhaled a
adelante,
long,
arrastrando
cold
su
breath.
pierna rígida.
He's
Las
going to
ruedas
Pier
del
4,
soporte del
Gabriel Gabriel stated. It wasn't a question.
Gabriel.
He's already there,
entre dientes,
Nora said.
Y recorrió la
She slumped
distancia
back against the
en
chair,
5
the adrenaline
largos pasos.
crash hitting her
Se
fast and
detuvo
hard.
justo frente a ella,
Her eyelids
sus
drooped.
manos flotando.
He's waiting for the
inseguras
Kensington
de
trucks to
dónde
arrive.
sujetarla. para no
Liam,
causarle
Gabriel
dolor.
barked without raising
Dije
his
que
voice.
vuelvas a la cama.
The study door pushed open
Estoy sangrando
instantly.
a través del
Liam
vendaje,
stood there, a
susurró
tactical
ella.
shotgun
Oí
slung
los
across his
coches.
chest.
Graba
Boss,
cogiendo.
Get the
Liam
men in the
salió.
armory.
Liam
Suppressed
está
weapons
retirando
only.
a los guardias
No
del
heavy
puerto
explosives.
y
We are
redirigiéndolos
going
al
to the
perímetro
docks,
de esta
and we are
propiedad.
going quietly.
Ahora, a la cama.
Gabriel stepped away
No
from
puedes
Nora's
leer los
chair,
discos,
his face
dijo
a
ella,
mask of
ignorando por
absolute,
completo su
chilling
orden.
calm.
Se apoyó con
Leave
todo
two
su
men on the
peso en el
perimeter of the
soporte del
house.
suero,
No
sus
one gets
nudillos
in.
blancos, e
Liam
inclinó la
nodded
cabeza
grimly
hacia
and
atrás para
vanished.
mirarlo.
Gabriel turned back
No
to the
tienes la
desk.
clave
He opened
descifrado.
the heavy bottom drawer
Vuelas a
and
ciegas,
pulled out a
Gabriel.
sleek, compact,
Él la
Sig
miró.
Sauer.
El
He
agudo
checked the
olor
magazine, slammed
antiséptico
it
de
home,
Víctor
and racked the slide.
persistía en su piel,
He set the gun on the desk,
mezclado con
right
un
next to
vago olor
Nora's empty whiskey
subterráneo,
glass.
algo así como
Nora
papel
stared at the
seco y
black
lluvia.
metal. I don't know
Puedo
how to
encargarme de mi
shoot.
tío y de
You
la
pointed
familia
at the door.
Kensington
If
sin una
anyone
hoja de
opens it
cálculo.
who isn't me,
No,
you pull the
no
trigger
puedes,
until it clicks
replicó
empty.
Nora.
Gabriel
Un
walked
destello de
around the desk,
irritación
standing
genuina
directly in front of
atravesó
her.
finalmente
He
su
reached out,
agotamiento.
his knuckles brushing lightly
Carlo no
against her
solo desvió
unbruised
el
cheek.
dinero del catering,
Her skin was
les
still
dio el
entirely
plano
too
del
hot.
arsenal del sur,
Lock the door behind
les
me.
dio las
Do not open
rotaciones
it.
de los turnos de tu
Do you
detalle
understand?
personal.
Nora
Si
looked up at
entras
him.
en guerra
The
esta
cynical,
noche sin
detached
saber
assistant was gone.
exactamente
The
qué
woman
les
looking
vendió,
back at him was
te van a
stripped
masacrar
raw,
a tu gente.
terrified but entirely
Su
present.
pecho se
Gabriel,
elevaba.
she
El
whispered.
esfuerzo de
He
hablar
stopped, his
drenaba
hand
el
resting
poco
on the heavy
color que le
brass
quedaba
doorknob.
en el rostro.
Don't make me
Se
plan your
tambaleó
funeral, she
peligrosamente
said,
sobre su
her
pierna
voice
buena.
shaking.
Gabriel's
Gabriel's lips
atrapó por la
curved into a
cintura.
dark,
Su mano
genuine
grande
smile.
se posó plana
It didn't
sobre
reach
el
his
suave
eyes,
algodón
which
de
were
la
already
camisa,
dead, and
atrayéndola
focused on the
contra su
violence
pecho.
to come.
Ella
I
jadeó.
cancelled the wedding, Nora,
Una
he
inhalación
said softly.
corta y aguda,
I'm not putting you
y sus
through
manos
catering a
volaron
funeral
para
too.
agarrarle
He
los
stepped out into the
antebrazos.
hallway, pulling the
Por un
door shut
segundo,
behind him.
ninguno
He
se
heard the
movió.
heavy brass deadbolt slide into
contacto
place
físico era
with a definitive
impactante.
thunk.
Durante 4
Gabriel
años
turned
habían
toward the
existido
stairs,
en una
the
órbita
cold
profesional
logic of the
estéril,
impending
sin
slaughter
tocarse
taking over
nunca,
his mind.
sin cruzar
The
jamás
Kensington
la
family
línea de la
thought they were
oficina.
orchestrating a
Ahora
quiet
estaba
corporate
presionada
merger.
contra él.
They had no
ardiendo de
idea
fiebre,
they had just
su
woken the
corazón
monster.
golpeando
The
contra
docks
sus
at Pier 4
costillas como un
smelled of
pájaro
diesel
atrapado.
exhaust, rotting kelp,
Parecía
and rusted
imposiblemente
iron.
pequeña.
The rain had
Sin
slowed to a
embargo,
persistent,
sostenía
freezing
todo el
drizzle,
peso de
leaving
su
the world
supervivencia
slick and
en su
coated in a
cabeza
greasy
amoratada.
sheen. Gabriel
Suéltame,
stepped out of the black
murmuró,
SUV,
mirando
his
hacia
boots
su
hitting
pecho,
the cracked asphalt without a
negándose a
sound.
encontrarlo con
He
la
didn't
mirada.
slam the door,
Te vas
he
a
just
caer.
pushed it
Voy a la
until the
oficina,
latch clicked.
corrigió ella,
Liam fell
su
in
voz
beside
tensa
him,
por un
carrying
pánico
the suppressed
extraño y
tactical
defensivo.
shotgun at a low
Necesito
ready.
mi portátil.
Out of the
Necesitas un
shadows of the
hospital.
stacked shipping containers,
Gabriel
6 more
cambió su
of
agarre,
Gabriel's men
con la
materialized.
intención
They were
plena de
dressed in flat
levantarla de
black,
nuevo.
their
Las
faces
manos de
obscured
Nora
by the
se
collars of their
aferraron a
wet
sus
jackets.
brazos, sus
Nobody
uñas
spoke.
cortas clavándose
They had
en su piel.
memorized the blueprints Nora
Gabriel,
had pulled.
Por
They
favor,
knew the blind spots.
la palabra
They
lo
knew the
detuvo.
angles.
Ella
3
nunca
trucks
decía,
approaching
por
from the
favor.
south access road.
Organizaba,
Liam whispered,
ejecutaba,
pressing an earpiece
informaba,
deeper
no
into his ear.
suplicaba.
Heavy suspensions.
Finalmente miró
They're
su
empty,
rostro.
ready to load
Vio
the crates.
realmente el terror
Cut the power
crudo
to the halogen
y sin
towers,
filtrar que se
Gabriel said,
acumulaba en
his
sus
voice
oscuros ojos.
entirely devoid
No
of
era
inflection.
miedo a la familia
When the
Kensington.
trucks kill their engines,
Era
we
miedo
move.
a ser inútil.
No survivors on the
Se
Kensington
había
side.
muerto de
I want a
hambre
complete
y había
blackout.
vivido en la
A heavy
miseria
metallic
para
clunk
demostrar que
echoed
podía
across the
manejar
yard as the
sola
main
sus
breaker
cargas.
was thrown.
Estar
The towering
indefensa,
yellow security
ser
lights
cargada,
died
la
instantly,
aterrorizaba
plunging the
más que
pier
una
into an
bala.
aggressive,
Aflojó
suffocating darkness.
lentamente su agarre
The
en
only
su
illumination
cintura,
came
aunque
from the
mantuvo
sickly
sus manos
orange
cerca.
glow of the city skyline,
Una hora,
bouncing off the
concedió
low-hanging
Gabriel,
clouds.
su voz bajando
Gabriel
a un
unholstered his
susurro
Sig
ronco.
Sauer. The
Me
metal
das
was
las
ice
llaves,
cold
me
against his
muestras
palm.
los datos
He walked
y
forward,
luego te sientas
sliding
tú
between
sola.
2 towering
Nora
stacks of
esbozó
red
una
and blue
mueca
shipping
desgarrada y
containers.
sangrienta.
The air grew tighter.
Trato hecho.
He could hear the low,
La
throaty
pesada
hum
silla
of the
de cuero de
Kensington box
Gabriel
trucks
la
rolling through the
engulló.
main gate,
La
their
había
headlights
rodado
cut.
hasta el frente
They
del
were arrogant.
escritorio,
They thought
negándose
they
a
had the
dejarla
keys to the
caminar
castle.
los
They
5
parked in a
metros
neat row
extra
in front of Warehouse
detrás de
7.
él.
The heavy roll-up door
Arrastró
of the
una
warehouse
pesada
was
silla de
already
madera
open.
para su pierna herida,
Standing just inside the
apoyándola
threshold,
con cuidado.
illuminated by the beam of a single
Nora no
tactical
esperó a
flashlight,
que él
was
terminara de
Carlo
arreglarlo
Romano.
todo a su alrededor.
Gabriel stopped.
Atrajo
He
el
stood in the
portátil
shadow
hacia
of a
ella,
rusted
sus
crane,
dedos
30
volando
feet
sobre las
away,
teclas.
watching his uncle
El
pull a silver
movimiento era
flask from his coat.
entrecortado,
unscrew the cap, and take a long drink. Carlo looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had just secured his retirement. 3 Kensington enforcers hopped out of the lead truck. They were big men, carrying unsuppressed assault rifles, moving with the sloppy confidence of a crew that expected no resistance. You got the codes for the inner vault, Carlo? The lead enforcer asked, his voice carrying over the sound of the water slapping against the wooden pylons. Already punched in, Carlo replied, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Make it quick. Gabriel is busy looking for his missing secretary. He won't notice the armory is empty until tomorrow afternoon. Gabriel stepped out of the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked into the open yard, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. Carlo saw him first. The older man's hand froze mid-air, the silver flask slipping from his grip and clattering against the concrete. The liquid spilled out, dark and smelling of cheap brandy. Gabriel! Carlo choked out. The 3 Kensington men spun around, raising their rifles. They never got the chance to pull the triggers. From the darkness above the shipping containers, Liam and the strike team opened fire. The suppressed weapons sounded like heavy staple guns. Thwip, thwip, thwip. It was incredibly, brutally fast. The lead Kensington enforcer dropped instantly. A neat hole punched through his temple. The second man took 2 rounds to the chest and folded over the hood of his truck, his blood sliding down the wet grill. The third managed to get off one wild, deafening shot into the sky before Liam's shotgun took out his knees, sending him crashing to the pavement, where a final, quiet pistol shot ended his screaming. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in Gabriel's ears. Carlo was backed up against the corrugated metal wall of the warehouse. His hands were raised, shaking violently. His eyes darted from the bodies of the Kensington men to Gabriel, who was still walking slowly toward him. Gabriel, wait! Carlo pleaded. His voice cracked, the confident swagger vanishing into pure, unfiltered panic. It's not what you think. They forced me. Sloane's father. He threatened my daughters. He said he would kill your cousins if I didn't give him the warehouse. Gabriel stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the man who had bought him his first bicycle. He looked at the man who had poured whiskey on his father's grave. You don't have daughters, Carlo, Gabriel said quietly. You have 2 ex-wives who hate you, and a gambling debt at the Bellagio that maxed out at $3 million on Monday. Carlo's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The lie had died in his throat. You sold my life and the lives of my men to cover a bad streak at the baccarat table, Gabriel continued. He didn't feel angry. He felt nothing at all. It was a terrifying, hollow void in his chest. You used a Kensington courier to hide the paper trail, but you were sloppy. My assistant found you. A secretary? Carlo spat, a desperate, ugly sneer twisting his face as he realized begging wouldn't work. You're going to burn your own blood for a glorified typist? She isn't a typist, Gabriel said. He raised the Sig Sauer, locking his elbow. She's the woman who just ended your life. Gabriel squeezed the trigger. The gun barked twice. 2 center mass. Carlo hit the concrete, sliding down the corrugated metal wall, leaving a wide, dark smear behind him. He gasped once, a wet, rattling sound, and then his eyes glazed over. Staring up at the rain, Gabriel lowered the gun. The smell of burnt gunpowder mixed with the salt water. He stood over the body for a long minute, letting the cold rain wash over his face, soaking into his hair. Boss, Liam said quietly, stepping up beside him. The trucks are secure. No one else is coming. Load the bodies into the back of the Kensington trucks, Gabriel ordered, turning his back on his uncle. Drive them to the airstrip. Leave the trucks parked directly in front of Sloane's father's private jet. Leave the keys in the ignitions. Liam nodded.
El bajón
And
de
Carlo?
adrenalina golpeándola
Gabriel
rápida
paused.
y duramente.
He looked down at the silver
Sus
flask
párpados
sitting
se
in the
cerraron.
puddle of brandy and
Está
rainwater.
esperando que lleguen los
Putting the
camiones de
driver's seat.
Kensington.
Let
Liam,
Sloane's father
ladró
see
Gabriel
exactly
sin
what happens
alzar
to
la
his
voz.
investments.
La puerta
He
de la
walked back to
oficina
his
se abrió al
SUV.
instante.
The adrenaline was
Liam
leaving his
estaba
system,
allí,
replaced
un
by a
fusil
deep,
táctico con
aching
silenciador
exhaustion.
colgando sobre su
He
pecho.
slid into the driver's seat,
Jefe,
slamming the door shut,
trae a los
and
hombres al
turned the key.
arsenal. Solo
He didn't
armas
look
con
back at the
silenciador.
warehouse. He
Sin
put the car in
explosivos
gear and
pesados.
drove away from the docks,
Vamos a los
the
muelles,
tires
y
tearing
vamos
through the
en
flooded
silencio.
streets, heading
Gabriel
back to the only
se
person
alejó
in
de
his
la silla
entire
de Nora.
empire who had
Su rostro
actually
una
protected him.
máscara de
The
calma
drive back
absoluta
felt
y
endless.
tortuosa.
Gabriel's hands gripped the
Deja
leather
a
wheel
dos
until
hombres
his
en el
knuckles
perímetro
ached.
de la casa.
His suit weighed
Que
heavily
nadie
on his
entre.
shoulders, reeking of
Liam
damp wool,
asintió
gunpowder,
sombríamente y
and the copper
desapareció.
tang of blood.
Gabriel
When he walked
se
into the
volvió hacia el
pristine,
escritorio,
lemon-scented foyer
abrió
of
el
his estate,
pesado cajón inferior
the
y
luxury
sacó
turned
una
his stomach.
pistola compacta.
The real
Una
world
Sig
was the
Sauer.
freezing bathroom on
Verificó el
Garrison
cargador,
Street.
lo golpeó de
He
nuevo
walked
en
down
su
the
sitio
shadowed corridor
y
to his study.
amartilló el slide.
The brass knob didn't
Colocó el
turn.
arma en
The
el
deadbolt was
escritorio,
thrown.
justo
He
al
leaned
lado
his
de la
forehead
copa
against
de
the
whisky
cool wood,
vacía de
a
Nora.
tight knot forming in
Nora
his throat.
miró el metal negro.
She had listened to him.
No sé disparar,
Nora, he
señaló
said
hacia la
softly.
puerta.
A
Si
heavy
alguien
wooden
abre
stool
esa puerta
scraped
que no
across the
sea yo,
floorboards inside.
aprietas el gatillo
The deadbolt
hasta que se
snicked
quede
back.
sin balas.
The door cracked open,
Gabriel
revealing
rodeó el
Nora's dark,
escritorio,
exhausted
parándose
eye.
justo frente
The door
a ella.
swung wide. She
Extendió
was
la
slumped
mano,
against the frame,
sus nudillos
swallowed by his
rozando
oversized
suavemente
black
su
shirt.
mejilla no
In her
amoratada.
right hand,
Su piel
dangling
aún
toward the
estaba
floor,
demasiado
was the
caliente.
Sig Sauer.
Cierra
Her
la
finger
puerta con
rested
llave
flat
después de que
outside
me
the
vaya.
trigger guard,
No
but her
la
grip
abras,
on the metal was
¿entiendes?
white-knuckled.
Nora lo miró.
Gabriel stepped
La
inside,
asistente
kicking the
cínica
door
y
shut.
distante había
He reached out,
desaparecido.
gently wrapping
mujer
his
que lo
large
miraba
hand
estaba
around the barrel of the
desbocada,
gun, easing it from
aterrorizada,
her rigid fingers.
pero completamente
He engaged the
presente.
safety and tossed it onto the
Gabriel,
sofa. You didn't
susurró.
shoot me,
Se
Gabriel
detuvo,
noted, his voice
su mano
rough.
descansando en el
You
pesado pomo
knocked,
de latón.
Nora whispered,
¿Y si me pones
scanning
a
his ruined
planificar tu
shirt,
funeral?
the dark stains
Dijo
on
ella,
his cuffs.
con la voz temblorosa.
Did you?
Los
Carlo is
labios de
dead.
Gabriel
The Kensingtons
se
leave
curvaron en
tomorrow.
una sonrisa oscura y
Nora
auténtica.
closed her eyes. The
No le llegó a
tension
los
snapping in
ojos,
her shoulders
que
took
ya
her
estaban
balance with it.
muertos y
Her good
concentrados
leg
en la
buckled.
violencia que se
Gabriel
avecinaba.
caught her mid-collapse,
Cancelé la
scooping
boda,
her up
Nora.
against his chest.
No te voy a poner
She
a
didn't fight
organizar
him.
ningún funeral.
She just rested her bruised
Salió al
cheek
pasillo,
against his damp shoulder,
cerrando la
her
puerta
breathing
detrás de él.
shallow. He carried her
Oyó
past
el
the
pesado
desk,
cerrojo
ignoring the
del latón,
laptop screen still
deslizarse
displaying
de
his
nuevo en su
uncle's
lugar,
ruined
con
empire,
un chasquido
and walked
definitivo.
straight into his private master suite.
Gabriel
He
se
bypassed
volvió
the
hacia
guest
las
room
escaleras.
entirely.
La lógica
The room was
fría del
warm,
inminente
heated by
masacre,
a stone
tomando el
fireplace.
control de su
He laid
mente.
her gently in the center of the
La
massive
familia
bed.
Kensington creía
I
que
need to
estaba
wash,
orquestando
Gabriel
una
said,
fusión
staring at his
corporativa
grease and
silenciosa.
blood-stained
No
hands.
tenían ni idea
Don't
de
move.
que acababan de despertar
Can't feel
al
my leg
monstruo.
anyway. She
Los
murmured.
muelles del muelle
In the
olían a
ensuite,
escape de diésel,
Gabriel turned the
a
water on
putrefacción
scalding
y a
hot.
hierro oxidado.
He scrubbed away the
La
docks,
lluvia
the
se había
gunpowder,
reducido
and his
a una
uncle's memory,
llovizna
watching
persistente y helada,
pink-tinged water
dejando el
swirl
mundo
down the
brillante
marble
y
drain.
cubierto de un
He stripped
barniz
off his ruined
grasiento.
suit and shirt,
Gabriel
toweled
bajó
off,
del SUV
and walked
negro,
back in,
sus
wearing
botas
only his dark
golpeando el
trousers.
asfalto agrietado sin
Nora was
hacer
staring
ningún
at the
sonido.
ceiling.
No
Gabriel
cerró
sat
la
on the edge
puerta
of the
de
mattress.
golpe. Solo la empujó
Victor said you
hasta
need
que
sleep.
hizo clic.
My brain
Liam
won't shut
cayó a
off,
su lado,
she replied,
llevando
rolling
el
her
fusil
head to look at his
táctico
bare
con
chest,
silenciador
the syndicate
a la
ink,
altura de
the
la
pale
cadera.
scars.
De entre
What
las
happens
sombras
tomorrow?
de los contenedores
I
apilados,
explained the new terms of
aparecieron
existence
otros
to
6
Sloane's
hombres de
father.
Gabriel.
Sloane
Vestidos
was a
de negro
strategic
liso,
alliance,
sus
she said,
rostros
her voice
oscurecidos por los
thin but
cuellos
stubborn.
altos de sus chaquetas
If you cut the
mojadas.
Kensingtons off,
Nadie
you
habló.
lose 20% of your
Habían
gross
memorizado
margin.
los planos
Gabriel
que
let out a
Nora
harsh,
había sacado.
disbelieving laugh.
Sabían los
He
puntos
leaned over,
ciegos.
bracing his
Sabían
hands on the
los
mattress
ángulos.
beside her shoulders.
3
The fever
camiones
heat still
acercándose
radiated
por la
off her
vía de
skin.
acceso sur.
I just
Susurró
dismantled
Liam,
a hostile
presionando un
takeover,
auricular
executed
más
my own blood,
profundamente en su
and
oído.
carried you out of a slum.
Suspensiones
And you are
pesadas
quoting
están
gross
vacíos,
margins
listos
at me.
para cargar las cajas.
Someone has to
Corten
keep
la
the books
alimentación de las
balanced.
torres de halógeno.
I was blind without you.
Hazlo,
He
dijo
corrected
Gabriel,
softly.
su voz
The professional
completamente plana.
distance they had
Cuando
meticulously
los camiones
maintained for
apaguen apaguen los
4
motores,
years,
nos
vanished.
movemos.
He brushed
Sin
his thumb
supervivientes
gently
del
against
lado
her
de
jawline.
Kensington.
Your
Quería
mother's
un
facility
apagón
is fully
total.
funded through my
Un
private
fuerte
trust.
chasquido
The
metálico
apartment
resonó
on
en el
Garrison
patio,
Street is done.
mientras el interruptor
Liam is
principal
packing your
era
things,
accionado.
and then he's burning that
Las
building
altas
to the
luces de
ground.
seguridad amarillas
Nora's
se
lips
apagaron al
parted.
instante, sumiendo
can't
el
just
muelle en
mandate
una
my life.
oscuridad agresiva
I
y
just did.
sofocante.
He leaned
La
closer,
única
smelling
iluminación
the sharp
provenía
antiseptic
del
on her
brillo
skin.
anaranjado y
bled
enfermizo
for
del
me.
horizonte de la ciudad,
You are never going back to
reflejado
a
en las
desk
nubes
outside my
bajas.
door. You
Gabriel
are staying in this room.
desenfundó su Sig
She
Sauer.
swallowed hard.
El metal estaba
I'm your
frío
assistant.
como el hielo en su palma.
No, Gabriel
Avanzó,
whispered, the
deslizándose
desperate
entre
need in
dos
his chest
pilas altas
settling
de
into a
contenedores
cold,
de envío
possessive
rojos y
certainty.
azules. El aire
You're
se
my
hizo más
partner.
denso.
And if
Podía
anyone
oír
ever
el
looks at you
zumbido
sideways
gutural y
again,
grave de los
I will tear
camiones
their
de
eyes out.
Kensington rodando por la
Nora
puerta
looked at the man
principal
who had
con los
orchestrated a
faros
slaughter,
apagados.
looking at her as if she
Eran
anchored him
arrogantes.
to the earth.
Creían que
She
tenían
let
las
out a
llaves
long,
del castillo.
slow breath.
Estacionaron en
The
fila
pragmatic
ordenada
walls
frente al
finally
depósito.
falling away.
La
I
pesada
prefer
puerta del
wild mushroom
depósito
over the
ya
truffle risotto
estaba
anyway,
abierta,
she mumbled,
de pie,
her heavy eyelids
justo dentro del
sliding shut.
umbral. Iluminado
Gabriel's
por el haz
chest
de una
hitched with
sola
a genuine,
linterna
quiet
táctica,
laugh.
estaba
He
Carlo
pulled the
Romano.
dark linen sheets over her
Gabriel se
shoulders.
detuvo.
He didn't
Se paró
leave.
en la sombra
He
de
lay
una
down
grúa
on top of the
oxidada a
covers
30
beside her,
pies de distancia,
watching the shadows dance
observando
on
a
the
su tío
ceiling,
sacar una
listening to
petaca
her
de
breathe.
plata de su
The
chaqueta,
sunlight cut through the tall
destapar el
windows of the
tapón
master
y
suite
dar un
like a
largo
physical
trago.
blade, bright and
Carlo
uncompromising.
parecía relajado.
Gabriel was already
Parecía
awake.
un hombre que
He stood by the
acababa de
window,
asegurar
wearing
su
a fresh
jubilación.
white shirt, the sleeves
Tres
rolled up to
hombres
his
de
elbows,
Kensington
a cup of black
saltaron del
coffee in
camión
one
principal.
hand, and a newly
Eran
activated
grandes.
burner phone in the
Llevaban
other.
rifles de asalto
It was
sin
8 a.m.
silenciador,
The phone
moviéndose con
vibrated
la
against his
confianza
palm.
negligente
The caller
de
ID
un
was a
equipo que
Boston
no
area
esperaba
code.
resistencia.
Gabriel took a slow sip of
¿Tienes
his
los
coffee.
códigos para el
The
almacén
bitter
interior,
heat
Carlo?
coated his tongue.
Preguntó el
He hit
hombre
accept
principal,
and
su
brought the
voz
phone to
ahogando
his
el
ear.
sonido de la lluvia, golpeando
Gabriel,
los pilares de
Richard
madera.
Kensington's voice boomed
Ya los
through the
tengo,
speaker.
replicó
It
Carlo,
wasn't the smooth,
limpiándose la
arrogant
boca con
tone
el
of a
dorso de la
patriarch
mano.
planning a hostile
Háganlo
takeover.
rápido.
It
Gabriel
was
está
tight.
ocupado
It was
buscando
the
a su
sound of a
asistente
man who had
desaparecida.
just looked into the
No
back of a
notará que el
box truck
arsenal
and
está
seen his own
vacío hasta
mortality.
mañana por la tarde.
What have you done? I
Gabriel
returned your property,
salió de
Richard,
las sombras.
Gabriel said,
No
his
corrió,
voice smooth,
no gritó,
carrying no malice,
solo caminó
only
hacia el patio
absolute
abierto.
authority.
La
I hope
grava
the flight back to
crujiendo
Boston was
suavemente
comfortable.
bajo sus botas.
You murdered Carlo.
Carlo
You
lo vio
slaughtered my
primero.
men. This
La
is an
mano
act
del hombre
of
mayor
war.
se congeló
This
en
is
el
an
aire.
eviction notice.
La petaca
Gabriel
de plata
corrected.
resbaló de sus
He
dedos
turned,
y
looking
se
at the bed.
estrelló contra el concreto.
Nora was still
El
asleep,
líquido se
her
derramó,
breathing deep and
oscuro
even,
y
the
oliendo
fever
a
finally
cognac
broken
barato.
during the night.
Gabriel,
The dark bruising
se
on her face
atragantó Carlo.
was stark against
Los
the white
tres hombres de
pillows,
Kensington
a
se
violent
giraron,
reminder of the price
levantando
she
sus
had paid.
rifles.
Gabriel's
Nunca
eyes
tuvieron
hardened.
oportunidad de apretar el gatillo.
Listen to me very carefully, Richard.
Desde la
The
oscuridad
murderer
sobre
is
los
dead.
contenedores de
Sloan
envío,
is entirely
Liam
free
y
to
el
pursue
equipo de
other
asalto
arrangements.
abrieron fuego.
But if your syndicate
Los
attempts
rifles con
to move
silenciador
product through my
sonaban como
ports,
pistolas de
if your
grapas
trucks
pesadas.
cross the city line,
Era
or if I
increíblemente
so much as
rápido.
smell one of your
Brutalmente
enforcers in
rápido.
my territory,
El hombre principal
I
de
won't send the
Kensington
bodies back
cayó
next
al
time.
instante.
I will bring
Un
them to your
agujero
front door
limpio
myself.
perforado en su
You
sien.
arrogant son of a
El
bitch.
segundo
You
hombre
can't run the
recibió
shipping
dos
lines without my
disparos en el
capital.
pecho
You'll
y se
bleed out
dobló
in
sobre el
6
capó de
months.
su camión.
I have
Su
better
sangre
accountants than you
resbalando
think,
por la parrilla
Gabriel said,
mojada.
his gaze
El
fixed
tercero
softly on
logró
Nora.
disparar un tiro
Do not
salvaje
call me
y
again.
ensordecedor al
He hung
cielo
up the phone
antes de
and
que el
dropped it
rifle
into
de
his
Liam
pocket.
le
From the bed,
destrozara
there
las
was a
rodillas,
soft rustle of linen.
enviándolo a derrumbarse
Nora
sobre el
shifted,
asfalto,
wincing
donde un
slightly as the
último tiro
movement pulled at the
silencioso
stitches in her thigh.
acabó con sus gritos.
She opened her eyes,
El silencio que
blinking
siguió fue
against the
pesado,
harsh morning light.
zumbando en los oídos de
She looked
Gabriel.
around the massive,
Carlo
unfamiliar
estaba
room,
apoyado
her
contra
gaze
la pared
finally landing
metálica
on Gabriel
ondulada
standing
del
by the
depósito.
window.
Sus manos estaban
Did you shoot the phone?
levantadas,
She
temblando
asked, her voice
violentamente.
raspy with sleep.
Sus ojos se movían de los
Gabriel walked
cuerpos de
over
los
to the
hombres de
nightstand,
Kensington
setting
a
his coffee
Gabriel,
cup down.
que todavía
I
caminaba
handled Richard.
lentamente hacia
Nora
él.
slowly pushed herself up,
Gabriel,
bracing her
espera,
back against the headboard.
imploró Carlo.
She looked
Su
down at
voz
the
se
oversized black shirt
La
she was wearing,
arrogante
then
confianza
at the heavy
desaparecida,
brace on her leg.
reemplazada por un
The memories
pánico
of the night
crudo y
before,
sin filtros.
the freezing bathroom,
No es lo que
the
crees.
needle.
Me obligaron.
the chaotic ride to the estate, and the
Amenazó a
intense,
mis hijas.
suffocating
Dijo que
promise
mataría a
Gabriel
mis
had made
primos
her
si no le daba el
rushed back.
depósito.
She looked up at him.
Gabriel
He was
se
watching her
detuvo
with
a
a
10
quiet,
pies de distancia.
intense focus.
Miró al hombre que le
He
había
wasn't the
comprado su
polished,
primera bicicleta.
unapproachable boss this
Miró
morning.
al hombre que había
He was the
vertido
man
whisky
who had
sobre la
knelt in
tumba
her
de su
blood.
padre.
So,
No tienes
Nora
hijas,
said,
Carlo.
clearing
Dijo
her throat,
Gabriel
trying to
lentamente.
find her professional footing.
Tienes dos ex
The
esposas
Kensington
que te
network is
odian
out.
y una
We're going to
deuda de
have to
juego en
restructure
el
the
Bellagio
offshore
que
accounts by
llegó a los
Tuesday,
3
or the
millones
shell
de
companies are
dólares
going
el
to flag
lunes.
the IRS.
La boca de
Gabriel
Carlo se
leaned
abrió,
over,
pero
bracing his
ningún
hands on the
sonido
mattress
salió.
on either side of her
La
hips,
mentira
effectively
había muerto
trapping
en su
her.
garganta.
The scent of soap and
Vendiste
black
tu vida y
coffee
las vidas de
enveloped
mis
her.
hombres para cubrir una mala
Stop,
racha
Gabriel
en la
said
mesa de
softly.
Baccarat.
I'm just
Continuó
saying,
Gabriel.
if we don't
No
pivot.
sentía ira.
Nora, look
No
at me.
sentía nada.
She stopped
Era un
talking.
vacío
She met his
aterrador en
eyes.
su pecho.
They were dark,
Usaste un
deep,
mensajero
and
de Kensington
completely
para
stripped of the
ocultar el
corporate
rastro
mask.
de los papeles.
Your laptop is locked
Pero
in the
fuiste
study,
descuidado.
Gabriel told her.
Mi
You are
asistente
not
te
touching a
encontró.
spreadsheet for 2 weeks.
Una secretaria,
Victor is coming back at
escupió
noon
Carlo,
to check your
una
stitches
mueca
and
desesperada
start you
y
on a
fea,
proper diet.
torciendo su rostro
You are going
al
to
darse
rest.
cuenta de que la
I
súplica
don't do
no
well with
funcionaría.
resting, she muttered,
Vas a quemar a
a
tu
faint
propia
flush
sangre
creeping
por
into
una
her pale
mecanógrafa
cheeks at his
glorificada.
proximity. I'm
Ella
going to
no
get
es una
bored.
mecanógrafa,
Then I will entertain
dijo
you,
Gabriel.
Gabriel replied,
Levantó la
his voice
six-hour,
dropping to a
bloqueando
low,
su codo.
rough register
Es la mujer
that
que
sent a
acaba de
sudden shiver
terminar
down her
contigo.
spine.
Gabriel
But you are
apretó el
not
gatillo.
working.
La
You
pistola
are
ladró
healing.
2 veces.
Nora
Dos
looked at the
disparos
heavy
en el
gold
centro
watch
del
on his
pecho.
wrist, then
Carlo
at the
golpeó el
faint,
contenedor,
silver scars on his
resbalando
knuckles.
por la pared
She had
metálica
spent 4
ondulada,
years organizing
dejando
this
un
man's
rastro
life,
ancho y oscuro
anticipating
tras
his
de sí.
needs, cleaning up his
Jadeó una
messes.
vez,
She had
un
thought
sonido
she was
húmedo y
invisible to him.
traqueteante.
She had
Y
thought
luego
she was
sus
just
ojos
a
se
ghost in
volvieron
the machine.
vidriosos
She
mirando
raised her
hacia la
hand,
lluvia.
her fingers
Gabriel
trembling slightly,
bajó la
and
pistola.
rested her palm flat
El olor
against
a
the center
pólvora
of his
quemada
chest,
se mezcló con
right
el
over his
agua
heart.
salada.
She could
Se
feel
quedó
the
sobre el
steady,
cuerpo un
powerful
largo
rhythm of
minuto,
it beneath his
dejando
crisp
que la
shirt.
fría lluvia le lavara
You
la
cancelled a
cara,
multi-million-dollar wedding for
empapándose
me,
en su cabello.
she said quietly,
Jefe,
stating it not as a
dijo
question,
Liam en voz baja,
but as a terrifying
acercándose a
fact.
él.
She was
Los
finally
camiones
accepting.
están asegurados.
I cancelled a
No viene
business
nadie más.
transaction, Gabriel
Carguen
corrected,
los cuerpos
his
en la
hand
parte
coming up to
trasera
cover
de los
hers,
camiones de
pressing her
Kensington,
palm tighter
ordenó
against his
Gabriel,
chest.
dándole la
I burned
espalda
down
a
a
su
slum
tío.
for you. I
Llévenlos al
executed my
aeropuerto.
uncle for you.
Estacionen
I
los
would have
camiones
burned the
justo
entire
frente al
city
avión
to the
privado del
ground
padre
if
de
I hadn't
Sloan.
found you in
Dejen
time.
las llaves en el contacto.
Nora stared at him.
Liam
The
asintió.
cynical, pragmatic
Carlo,
walls she had
Gabriel
built around
hizo
her
una
heart,
pausa.
cracking and falling
Miró la
away.
petaca de plata en
There
el
was no
charco de
fairy tale
coñac y
here.
agua de lluvia.
He was a violent,
Ponlo en el asiento del
dangerous
conductor.
man.
Deja que
And
el
she
padre de
was the
Sloan
woman who
vea
kept his ledgers.
exactamente lo que le
Their
pasa a
hands
sus
were both
inversiones.
covered in blood.
Caminó de vuelta al
But in the
SUV.
cold,
La
brutal light
adrenalina
of the Mafia
abandonaba su
world,
sistema,
it was the truest
reemplazada por
form
un
of devotion
agotamiento
she had
profundo y
ever seen.
doloroso. Se
Okay,
deslizó en el
she
asiento del
whispered,
conductor,
her fingers
cerró la
curling
puerta
slightly
y
into his
giró la
shirt.
llave.
Okay,
No miró
Gabriel.
atrás hacia el
He didn't
depósito.
smile.
Puso
He
el
didn't
coche
need
en
to.
marcha y se
He leaned
alejó de los
down and
muelles,
pressed his lips
los
softly against her
neumáticos
forehead,
rasgando las calles
lingering there,
inundadas,
a silent,
dirigiéndose de vuelta a la
absolute
única
vow of
persona
protection.
en todo su imperio
The game was
que
over.
realmente lo había
The desk was
protegido.
gone.
El camino de
Nora
regreso
Quinn was no
pareció
longer the
interminable.
assistant in the shadows.
Las manos de
She was the
Gabriel
queen of the board,
apretaban el
and
volante de
Gabriel
cuero
Romano
hasta
was
que
never
sus
going to let
nudillos
her
le
fall
dolían.
again. And that
Su
is how
traje
you
pesaba
execute
sobre
a
sus
hostile
hombros,
takeover of the
oliendo
heart.
a lana mojada, a
Gabriel
pólvora
didn't just
y al
cancel
olor
his wedding.
metálico a
He
cobre de la
burned his
sangre.
old life to the
Cuando
ground
entró en
the
el
second he
prístino
realized
vestíbulo con
Nora
olor
was
a
the
limón
one
de su
truly
propiedad,
holding his empire
el lujo
together.
le provocó
Their
náuseas.
shift from
El mundo
boss/assistant
real era
to an
el baño
unstoppable,
helado de la
ruthless
calle
power
Garrison.
couple is exactly
Caminó
the
por el
kind of
pasillo
gritty loyalty
sombrío
we
hacia
love
su
to see.
oficina.
If
El
you
pomo
loved
de
this
la dona
dark,
no giró.
intense journey
El
and want
cerrojo
more
estaba
grounded
echado.
Mafia romances,
Apoyó la
where the
frente en la
quiet
fría
ones hold
madera.
all the power,
Un nudo
smash that
apretado
like button,
formándose en su
subscribe,
garganta.
and share
Ella
this
lo había
video.
escuchado.
Tell me in the comments,
Nora,
what was your favorite
dijo en
moment
voz
of
baja.
Gabriel's revenge?
Una pesada
See you in the
silla de
next
madera
story.
chirrió
He didn't
en
go
el
to her
suelo del
apartment for
interior.
love. He
El
went because she had the ledger, and Gabriel didn't trust loose ends. 2 days before a wedding that would merge two syndicates, his notoriously punctual assistant vanished. When he finally kicked in the rotting wood of her front door, expecting betrayal, the metallic scent of copper stopped him dead.
Colgando
he
hacia el
found in
suelo
that suffocating,
estaba la Sig Sauer.
blood-stained room
Su dedo
didn't just
descansaba
break his
plano fuera del
meticulously ordered
guardamonte,
world apart.
pero su agarre
It
sobre
made
el
him call
metal
off the
era
wedding
blanco
entirely.
por la
The
tensión.
chalk scratched against the wool blend
Gabriel
of
entró,
Gabriel's trousers,
cerrando la
a
puerta
dry,
detrás de él.
irritating sound that
Extendió la
vibrated
mano,
straight through to his
envolviendo
skin.
suavemente su
He stood
gran
perfectly
mano
still on the
alrededor del
velvet-covered
cañón de la
pedestal,
pistola,
staring straight ahead
retirándola
into
de
the
sus
gilded mirror.
rígidos dedos.
The reflection
Accionó
staring
el
back at him
seguro
belonged
y la
to a
arrojó
man
al
who had
sofá.
successfully
No me
sanitized his own
disparaste,
brutality.
observó
The suit was
Gabriel,
charcoal,
su
cut
voz
close
áspera.
to the ribs to hide
Tú.
the bulk of the leather
Ella
shoulder
respiró
holster
hondo,
he refused to
escaneando
take
su
off,
camisa
even for
arruinada.
fittings. Don't
Las
breathe so
manchas
heavily,
oscuras
Gabriel,
en los puños.
Sloane murmured from the plush
¿Hiciste?
leather sofa behind him.
¿Carlo está muerto?
She didn't look up from her
La
phone.
familia
Her
Kensington
thumbs
se va
tapped
mañana.
rhythmically against the glass
Nora
screen,
cerró los ojos.
firing off demands to people
tensión que
whose
se
names
rompía en
she
sus
wouldn't
hombros
bother to
le
remember.
quitó el equilibrio.
Bianchi needs the break over the shoe
Su
to be
pierna buena
perfect.
cedió.
You're shifting.
Gabriel la
Gabriel didn't
atrapó a
reply.
mitad de la caída,
He rolled his jaw,
levantándola
feeling
contra
the
su pecho.
familiar, dull
Ella
ache
no
of a
luchó
tension
contra él.
headache blooming
Solo
at the base
apoyó
of his
su
skull.
mejilla amoratada
The
en su
air in the
hombro
boutique was
mojado.
thick with the scent of
Atravesó el
lavender oil
pasillo
and
con su
stale money.
respiración superficial,
It was
pasando
suffocating.
por delante
The
del
hydrangeas,
escritorio,
Sloane
ignorando
said,
la pantalla
finally
del
looking up.
portátil, que
Her
aún
blonde hair
mostraba
was
el
pulled
imperio
back into a
arruinado de
severe,
su tío,
sleek knot.
y se dirigió directamente
She was
a su
beautiful in the
propia
way a
suite
freshly
matrimonial
forged blade was
privada.
beautiful.
Evitó por
Sharp,
completo la habitación
cold,
de
and
invitados.
entirely
La habitación
unyielding.
estaba cálida,
My mother
calentada
thinks
por
they
una
look too
chimenea de
funereal.
piedra.
I
La
told her we are
depositó
merging the
suavemente en el
Kensington
centro de la
distribution
enorme
lines with the
cama.
Romano ports.
Necesito
We aren't
lavarme,
throwing a
dijo
carnival.
Gabriel,
White,
mirando
silver,
sus manos
black.
manchadas de grasa y
That's the
sangre.
palette. Whatever
No
you
te
want,
muevas.
Sloane. Gabriel
No
said,
siento mi
his voice
pierna de
flat.
todos modos.
It was a
murmuró
transaction,
ella.
a
En el
contract
baño,
sealed in
Gabriel
imported
abrió el
silk and
grifo de
300
agua
guests.
caliente,
He
lavó
didn't
los
love her.
muelles, la
She didn't
pólvora
love him.
y el recuerdo de
They
su
understood
tío,
each other
viendo
perfectly,
cómo el agua
which was
teñida
exactly
de
why
rosa
the arrangement
giraba
was
en el
supposed to
desagüe de
work.
mármol.
But as
Se
Bianchi
despojó
pinned
del
the cuff,
traje y la
driving a
camisa
silver needle
arruinados,
through the fabric
se
with a
secó con la
practiced flick
toalla
of his
y
wrist,
regresó
Gabriel's
vistiendo
focus
solo sus
drifted.
pantalones negros.
He looked at the empty
Nora
space
miraba al
beside the
techo.
changing screen.
Gabriel se sentó en el
Nora
borde
wasn't
del
there.
colchón.
Nora Quinn had been his
Víctor
assistant
dijo
for
que
4
necesitas
years.
dormir.
She was the
Mi
buffer
cerebro
between
no
his
puede
violent,
parar,
chaotic reality
respondió ella,
and the sterile
girando la
corporate
cabeza para
front he
mirar su pecho
maintained.
desnudo.
She knew how he
La
took his
tinta
coffee,
del
black,
sindicato,
burning
las
hot,
pálidas
and she knew
cicatrices.
exactly how much cash
¿Qué
to
pasa
slip to the
mañana?
beat cops in the harbor district
Renegociamos
to
los
keep them
términos
looking
de
the
la
other way.
existencia del padre
She was
de
a
Sloane.
ghost in the machine,
Sloane
a
fue
woman
una
of
alianza
unremarkable
estratégica,
height,
dijo
practical
ella,
shoes,
su voz
and an
débil pero
unnerving
obstinada.
lack of intimidation.
Si cortas
When
a
the
los
Kensington
Kensington,
enforcers had crowded his
pierdes
office
el
last month,
20% de
posturing
tu
and
margen
throwing their weight
bruto.
around, Nora had
Gabriel
simply walked
soltó
through the
una
middle of
risa
them,
áspera
carrying
e
a stack of
incrédula.
files, and politely
Se
asked a
inclinó,
man twice her size
apoyando sus
to move
manos
his
en el
foot so she
colchón
could
a
vacuum the
ambos
rug.
lados de sus
She was
hombros.
always there.
El calor de la
Until
fiebre
48
aún
hours ago.
irradiaba de su piel.
Gabriel stepped off
Acabo
the
de
pedestal.
desmantelar una adquisición
Signore
hostil.
Romano,
Ejecuté a
Bianchi
mi
protested,
propia sangre
his hands
y te
fluttering.
saqué de un barrio
The jacket.
marginal.
We're
¿Y
done,
tú me citas
Gabriel
márgenes
said,
brutos?
shrugging off the
Alguien tiene
unfinished
que
coat
llevar la
and
cuenta de los
tossing it
libros.
over a velvet chair.
Estaba ciego sin ti.
Sloane finally put her
Corrigió él
phone down,
lentamente.
her perfectly
La
arched
distancia
eyebrows
profesional
drawing
que habían
together in
mantenido
a sharp line of
meticulosamente
irritation.
durante 4 años
Gabriel,
se
what are you
desvaneció.
doing? The wedding
Pasó
is
su
in 2
pulgar
days.
suavemente
The
por la
photographer
línea de
needs
su
the final.
mandíbula.
I have a
El
leak,
centro de tu madre
Gabriel
está
interrupted,
completamente
pulling his
financiado a
dark dress
través de mi
shirt from the rack and
fideicomiso
shrugging it
privado.
on.
El
He buttoned
apartamento de
it
la
with
calle
quick,
Garrison
impatient fingers.
está liquidado.
Nora hasn't
Liam
checked in
está
for 2
empacando
days.
tus cosas y luego va a
Sloane let out a
prenderle
short,
fuego a ese
elegant
edificio.
sigh,
Los
crossing her
labios de
long
Nora se
legs.
separaron.
Your
No
secretary,
puedes simplemente
fire her.
dictar mi vida.
Hire someone who understands
de
the
hacerlo.
stakes of this week.
Se inclinó más
She's
cerca,
probably just
oliendo
hungover
el agudo
or looking for a
antiséptico en
raise.
su piel.
Let
Tú
HR
sangraste
handle
por
it.
mí.
Gabriel
Nunca
stopped
volverás a
buttoning
un
his cuffs.
escritorio frente a mi
He looked
puerta.
at Sloane.
Te
Really
quedas en
looked
esta
at her.
habitación.
Her skin was
Ella tragó
flawless,
con
her
dificultad.
nails manicured,
Soy tu
her life
asistente.
entirely insulated
No,
from the blood that
susurró
paid for the
Gabriel,
ring on her
la
left hand.
necesidad desesperada en su
She's
pecho,
not a secretary,
asentándose en una
Gabriel
certeza
said,
fría
his
y
voice
posesiva.
dropping an octave,
Eres mi socia, y si alguien te mira de reojo, le arrancaré los ojos. Nora miró al hombre que había orquestado una masacre, mirándola a ella,
She has the
y
physical
la
ledger
forma
for
en
the
que la
dock
tomaba
payoffs.
como un botín
If she's
de
gone,
guerra.
She's either selling me out or she's dead. And you think dealing with a rogue employee is a priority right now? Sloane stood up, smoothing down her skirt. My father is flying in from Boston tonight. We have the rehearsal dinner. Send one of your thugs to find her. Gabriel strapped the leather holster across his chest. The heavy, comforting weight of the Glock pressed against his ribs. I don't send people to handle my liabilities, Sloane. I handle them myself. He walked out of the boutique before she could reply. The little brass bell above the door chiming a cheerful, mocking goodbye. The air outside was thick with the threat of rain. The sky above the city was a bruised, ugly purple. Gabriel pulled his coat collar up against the chill and walked briskly to the idling black SUV, parked illegally on the curb. His driver, Liam, flicked his cigarette into the gutter and scrambled into the driver's seat. "Where to, boss?" Liam asked, eyeing Gabriel's grim expression in the rearview mirror. "Southside," Gabriel said, staring out the window as the first heavy drops of rain began to smear the glass. Garrison Street, the apartment building at the dead end. Liam hesitated, his hands tightening on the wheel. "Garrison? Boss, that's Kensington territory. We're not supposed to have boots on the ground there until the ink is dry on the marriage certificate. Drive the car, Liam." The SUV pulled into traffic. Gabriel leaned back against the leather headrest, closing his eyes. The irritation in his chest was slowly morphing into something else. Something cold and ugly. He paid Nora a salary that should have secured her a high-rise downtown, with a doorman and secure parking. When he had demanded her home address from his head of security an hour ago, he had stared at the text message in disbelief. Garrison Street was a decaying artery of the city, choked with condemned buildings and desperate people. It was the kind of place where streetlights were shot out for privacy, and the police only came to collect bodies. Why was she living there? What kind of game was she playing? He thought back to the last time he saw her. Tuesday evening. The office was empty. She was standing by the shredder, feeding documents into the machine. She had looked tired. Her skin, usually a pale, healthy cream, had been sallow. He had noticed a bruise on her jawline, partially covered by poorly matched concealer. When he asked her about it, she had offered a dry, flat smile and blamed an open cabinet door. He had accepted the lie because it was convenient, because he had a wedding to plan. Gabriel opened his eyes, feeling a sudden, sharp twist of self-disgust. He had ignored the warning signs. If she had taken the ledger to the Kensingtons to derail the merger, he would have to kill her. The thought sat heavy in his stomach, a leaden weight that tasted like ash. He didn't want to kill Nora. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to demand why she had disrupted his perfectly ordered life. The city shifted around them as they drove. The glass and steel towers of the financial district gave way to the crumbling brick and rusted iron of the industrial sector. The rain fell harder now, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of the SUV. The streets narrowed, littered with overflowing dumpsters and broken glass that crunched beneath the heavy tires. "Pull over here," Gabriel ordered, as they approached a row of 4-story brick buildings that looked like they were slouching against one another for support. "I should come with you," Liam offered, putting the car in park and reaching for the door handle. "Stay with the car. Keep the engine running." Gabriel stepped out into the rain. The cold water immediately soaked through the shoulders of his coat. He didn't run. He walked with deliberate, heavy steps toward the entrance of the building. There was no buzzer. The glass in the front door had been smashed out and temporarily patched with a sheet of warped plywood. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed in protest. The stench hit him the second he crossed the threshold. It was a suffocating cocktail of boiled cabbage, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp, chemical tang of bleach, trying and failing to mask the scent of cat urine. The hallway was narrow, The walls
La
painted
red
a sickly,
Kensington está fuera.
institutional green
Tendremos que
that was peeling away
reestructurar
in
las
long,
cuentas
dry
offshore
strips.
para el martes.
A single
O las
fluorescent
empresas
tube flickered on
fantasma
the ceiling,
alertarán al
buzzing like an angry
IRS.
hornet. Gabriel's hand instinctively
inclinó,
brushed against the lapel
apoyando
of his
sus
coat,
manos en el
feeling
colchón
the hard
a ambos
outline of his
lados de
gun.
sus caderas,
He moved
atrapándola
silently up the stairs.
efectivamente.
The
El
wooden
olor a
steps
jabón
groaned
y
in
café
protest
negro
under his weight.
la envolvió.
He passed the second floor,
Para,
then the third.
dijo Gabriel
The sounds
en
of
voz
life
baja.
bled through
Solo
the
digo
thin
que si no
walls,
pivotamos.
a baby
Nora,
crying relentlessly. The muffled,
dejó de hablar.
tinny dialogue
Le
of a
sostuvo
game
la
show on a
mirada.
cheap television,
Eran oscuros,
an argument in a
profundos,
language he
y
didn't recognize.
completamente
It was a
despojados
world
de
of
la máscara
survival,
corporativa.
raw and
Tu
unpolished.
portátil está
The
bajo
exact
llave en mi
opposite of the
oficina,
world he had just
le dijo
left.
Gabriel.
The exact
No
opposite of
tocarás
Sloane.
ninguna hoja de cálculo durante
He
2
reached the
semanas.
fourth floor.
Víctor vendrá al
Apartment
mediodía a
4B.
revisar tus suturas y
The
ponerte
door
una
was heavy,
dieta adecuada.
solid oak that looked out of
Descansarás.
place in the dilapidated
No soy buena
building,
descansando,
though the wood was deeply
murmuró
scratched near the lock.
Un débil rubor
Gabriel reached out,
subiendo a sus
turning the
mejillas
brass
por
knob.
la cercanía de
It
él.
didn't catch.
Me
The
voy a
latch was
aburrir.
completely broken. The
Entonces
metal
te
casing
entretendré,
splintered.
replicó
He pushed the
Gabriel,
door open,
su voz
drawing his
bajando a
weapon
un
in
registro
one
grave
fluid,
y áspero,
practiced
que
motion.
envió un
He
escalofrío
stepped inside,
repentino por su
sweeping the
columna
room with the
vertebral.
barrel of the gun.
Pero no
The
trabajas,
apartment was
te
freezing.
curas.
It was colder
Nora
inside than
miró
it
el
was out
pesado
in the
reloj
rain.
de oro en su
There was
muñeca.
no heat.
Luego las
Gabriel
finas
stood in the
cicatrices
entryway,
plateadas en sus
blinking
nudillos.
against the gloom.
Había
The shades
pasado
were pulled
4
down
años
over the single
organizando la
window,
vida de este
casting the
hombre,
room in a heavy,
anticipando sus
grey
necesidades,
twilight. He
limpiando
lowered the
sus
gun
desastres.
slightly, his brow
Había
furrowing.
creído que
There
era
was no
invisible
furniture.
para él.
None.
Había creído
The
que era
living room
solo
was
un
an empty
fantasma
expanse
en
of
la
scuffed
maquinaria.
hardwood floor.
Levantó
No
la mano,
couch, no
sus
television,
dedos
no
temblorosos,
rugs.
y
The only
apoyó su
object in the
palma
room was a
plana
cheap
en
folding
el
table
centro de su
pushed
pecho,
against the far wall.
justo sobre su corazón.
On it sat
Podía
a
sentir
bulky,
su ritmo
outdated
constante y
laptop,
fuerte
a
bajo
stack
su
of heavily
impecable
encrypted
camisa.
external hard drives,
Cancelaste una
and
boda
a
de
neat,
varios millones de
meticulously
dólares por
organized
mí,
row of manila
dijo ella
folders.
en voz baja,
His folders,
afirmándolo no
the
como
syndicate's
una
business.
pregunta,
Where
sino
was her
como un
life?
hecho aterrador
Where was the
que
money he
finalmente
paid her?
estaba aceptando.
Nora! He called out.
Cancelé una
His voice
transacción
sounded
comercial,
too loud in the
corrigió
hollow
Gabriel,
space, harsh
su
and
mano
intrusive.
viniendo a cubrir
No
la de
answer.
ella,
Only the
presionando
sound
su
of the
palma
rain
más
lashing against the
firmemente contra
glass.
su pecho.
Gabriel
Quemé un
moved
barrio
further
marginal
into the
por ti.
apartment. He checked the
Ejecuté a mi
tiny
tío
galley
por
kitchen.
ti.
The refrigerator
Habría
was
quemado
unplugged,
toda la
the
ciudad,
door hanging
hasta
open to
los
reveal
cimientos,
empty
si no
wire
te hubiera
shelves.
encontrado a
The sink
tiempo.
was dry. He turned
Nora lo
down the
miró.
short hallway
Los
toward the
muros
bedroom
cínicos y
and the bathroom.
pragmáticos que había construido
That's when he saw
alrededor
it.
de su corazón
Smears of
se
dark,
agrietaban y
rusty brown
derrumbaban.
on the linoleum
No
floor.
había ningún cuento
Not
de hadas aquí.
splatters.
Era un
Drags.
hombre
The
violento y
dragging marks
peligroso.
of someone who couldn't
Y
lift
ella
their own
era la
weight.
mujer que
The
llevaba
metallic
sus
scent
libros.
of copper, sharp
Ambos
and
tenían
heavy,
las manos
cut through
manchadas
the
de
damp
sangre.
cold of the
Pero en la
apartment.
fría y brutal luz
Gabriel's
del mundo
pulse kicked
mafioso
against his throat.
era la forma
He
más
followed the
verdadera
trail.
de
It
devoción
led to the
que
half-open
ella había
bathroom
visto
door.
jamás.
He pushed the door
De
wide.
acuerdo,
The hinges
susurró,
didn't creak.
sus dedos
Nora was sitting on the
enroscándose
floor,
ligeramente en su
wedged in the
camisa.
narrow space
De
between the
acuerdo.
chipped porcelain bathtub
Gabriel
and the
no
toilet.
sonrió. No
She was
necesitaba
illuminated by
hacerlo.
a single,
Se
bare
inclinó y
bulb
presionó
hanging from a
suavemente
wire
sus
above
labios
the
contra
sink.
su frente,
She wasn't
demorándose
dead,
allí en un juramento
but she looked like she was
silencioso y
trying to be.
absoluto de protección.
She was wearing an oversized
juego
grey
había
T-shirt,
terminado.
completely
La
soaked
oficina
through with
había
sweat and
desaparecido.
dark, blossoming stains of
Nora
blood.
Quinn
Her
ya
bare
no era
legs
la
were splayed
asistente en
out in
las
front of her.
sombras.
A
Era la
thick,
reina del
bloody
tablero de
towel was
ajedrez.
wadded up and
Y
pressed
Gabriel
hard against her
Romano
left thigh.
nunca volvería
Her
a
head
dejarla
lolled to the
caer.
side against the
Y
bathtub.
así
Her
ejecutaron
skin
una
was the color
adquisición
of old
hostil del
parchment,
corazón.
grey, translucent,
Gabriel no solo
stretched
canceló la
tight
boda
over the
y
bones of her
quemó su
face.
antigua vida
The bruise he
hasta
had
los
seen on
cimientos
Tuesday
en el segundo
was now a
en que se
massive,
dio cuenta de que
ugly
Nora
sprawl of
era
purple
quien
and yellow,
realmente
covering
sostenía
half
su
her face.
imperio.
Her
Su
lower lip was
transición de
split.
jefe y asistente a
She
una
wasn't
pareja
holding
de
a phone.
poder imparable
She wasn't
y
holding his ledger to
despiadada
sell to the
es
Kensingtons.
exactamente
She was
el
holding a
tipo de
curved
lealtad
needle,
dura
threaded with
y
thick
cruda que
black
adoramos.
nylon. Her hands
Si te
were
ha gustado
shaking
este
so
oscuro e
violently,
intenso
she couldn't
viaje
find the grip
y
to
quieres
push it
más
through her own
novelas
skin.
mafiosas ancladas
Gabriel
en la
froze.
realidad, donde
For
los
a
de
man
abajo
who had
tienen
built an
todo el
empire
poder,
on
dale
violence,
al botón
who
de
had watched
me
men
gusta,
die without his
suscríbete
heart rate
y
spiking.
comparte este video.
The sight of his quiet,
Dime en los
unassuming
comentarios
assistant
cuál fue
trying
tu
to stitch
momento
up her own
favorito de la
bullet wound
venganza de
in a
Gabriel.
freezing,
Nos vemos
empty
en el
bathroom
próximo.